Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
I looked up from where I stood. Just a couple of steps and I would reach my destination. My heart hammered like 1,000,000 pounding drums. My head was dizzy with excitement. Behind me, I heard my friends grunt and pant as they struggled, clambering over the jagged and broken rocks. I stood straight and proud as I took the final step, summiting the cliff. I gazed over my shoulder to check on my friends. They weren't far behind. "Come on, hurry up, we're almost there," I called.
Jackson, how far is it from here?
Alice asked as she managed to wrench herself forward. "It's right there, over that cliff." She continued walking, and some other people followed. In all honesty, I didn't know most of them. I had only brought them along because I needed a good support team. There were 7, including me. Adam, Alice, and Brad were the only ones with whom I was well acquainted. They were fit for the job and very obedient, exactly what I needed. I wasn't thrilled about the fact that I would have to share my money with them after we achieved our goal and handed our pictures over to the mayor, but I had made peace with it. My only goal right now was to climb up Channel Mountain, get some pictures, and climb back down. Channel Mountain, as the articles say, is this mountain with a flat top. The place has a massive number of trees all over it, except for this clean path running north to south. A clear, channel-like road, hence the name, Channel Mountain. There is a way up from one side and a safer way down from the other. No one before us has had the guts to come up here, so of course I decided to do it. Build my own team and use my own technology to show everyone what this place actually looked like. Naturally, the money we'd receive was a strong incentive. Finally, I reached the very edge. I held my breath and took the final step up, too excited to wait for the rest of them. That was when I first saw Channel Mountain. It had more of an impact in person than anything the articles had conveyed. The air was thick and misty, like a cold cloud of shriveling fog. My breath froze within me at the very sight of it. The sky suddenly looked pale. There was a clear road at the center, and the corners stood lush, oddly shaped lines of trees. Their branches stretched long and far from the trunks. The trees looked quite healthy and well tended. Strange, I thought, as there was no one else up here to look after them. At least, that's what the article said. The path reached into the distance, as far as my eyes could see. It looked almost endless. The area ahead of me was blurred and obscured by the thick fog hanging in the air like stone-cold smoke. I admired what lay in front of me. That's when a strange feeling ignited and stirred inside my gut. A burning sensation, somewhere between foreboding and guilt. A feeling that warned me of danger, demanding that I turn away. I wanted to turn around and maybe forget about the whole thing, but my team finally caught up with me, and I heard most of them gasp when they saw what I saw.
Oh my God,
one of them said. There was a pause as my friends absorbed the atmosphere of the roadway.
Oh, wow.
Oh.
Never seen anything like this. Is this the place?
Brad asked, his voice raspy.
Why does it feel so creepy?
No, it wasn't creepy. Creepy wasn't the word to describe it. It was more unsettling. There was a visceral feeling of dangerous uncertainty flowing through the air of the place. No word I could think of was powerful or accurate enough to describe what we felt. I was just a tiny inch away from the mist of the forest. Just one more step and I would physically feel the fog. It took every ounce of willpower in me to convince myself to move on. But I reminded myself of the money and what I had put myself and my team through to get up here in the first place. We had already climbed for God knows how long to get to the top. After that much effort, I was quite sure no one would want to turn back. After all, the end of the mountain was a long way back down. Besides, the walk along the road wasn't that long either. It shouldn't take us more than 30 minutes to get to the other side.
Well, I guess we should get moving,
I said, trying to sound enthusiastic. My voice came out cracked and unconvincing. I took a step forward, then slowly and steadily stepped into the mist. The white fog gently stroked my skin, leaving light goosebumps all over me. I trembled a bit. Then, without warning, a feeling of dread poured over me, making me regret my decision almost immediately. Nothing about the place felt right. Darkness swept through my mind. I felt it, an extra presence. Someone or something apart from the other members of my team. Although no one was seen, there was a presence. I could feel it. An evil, deceptive danger watching us as we took every breath. My friends were utterly silent. Looking at them, I could see their fear. It was written all over their faces. They all wanted to turn back, but no one wanted to admit it. No one wanted to be the first one to snap under the pressure. After another pause, I continued to walk. Our footsteps echoed through the empty space. It was like walking through an empty, hollow shell. Our breathing had become unsettled and sharp as we kept alert, our eyes wide open and our ears sharper than ever. Adam, our camera boy, was immersed in his work. He snapped his flashlight at everything he saw. Everything of recording he documented to be taken back as the evidence needed to collect our prize money. Glancing down, I noticed that even the grass around the bases of the trees looked odd, like thin green needles found inside vaccination syringes. We walked around for 3 minutes, and some people began to complain.
Why are we even here? Is this even worth it?
Brad was starting his usual annoying behavior. At the moment, I had no interest in dealing with it.
For all the money we'd get, yes, it is,
I said, firmly. I was clearly lying to myself, but I couldn't let anyone see my weakness or question me at this point.
How do you know if there's even a way down? No one comes up here,
said Brad.
The articles predicted there would be.
They predicted. How would you know for sure we can get out of here?
Brad questioned.
He's got a point.
Alice cut in hesitantly, trying to make it look like she wasn't taking anyone's side. Everyone thought for a while. Then their half-expectant and half-angry eyes gazed at me, demanding an explanation. Of course, it was my plan, and by extension, problems that arose were my fault. But really, who wouldn't want a lifetime supply of money?
Guys,
I began.
this is not the time to blame each other.
Their faces looked more disapproving.
Look, we'll get out of here, I promise.
And what if we don't? It'll be your fault.
Brad was clearly not about to let this go. I sighed. Why did I bring him along?
Guys, look, for now, just trust me. Right at the end of this path, there is a way down. We'll just have to keep walking.
Everyone else seemed more relaxed as a result of my front of certainty, but Brad refused to budge.
So you got us up here without even knowing the goddamned way out?
I just told you how to get down.
I shot back.
You said the article predicted. How does predicted suggest anything close to certainty?
He was like an annoying 10-year-old. That's when I lost it.
Brad, if you don't shut up, I'll throw you down the cliff. If you stop being such a jerk, we can all leave this place with our sanity.
See? It's absolutely clear you don't know what you're doing.
My blood began to boil. He was right. All that he said was right, and that's what pissed me off.
Just shut up!
I screamed at him at the top of my lungs, almost tearing my vocal cords with the ferocity. Brad fell silent. Everyone fell silent. At first, I thought it was because of my outburst. But then I realized he wasn't looking at me. None of them were. They stared way past me, their eyes reflecting pure, underlying horror. I followed their gazes. It led into the dense line of trees. For a minute, I couldn't comprehend what had scared them so. Then I saw it. At first, relief washed through me. It looked like a figure of a lady, faded and unclear through the mist. She walked closer. I noticed her features grow more and more defined with every step. I noticed that she was tall, really tall. I noticed that her skin was covered in scars. No, not scars. It looked more like the skin on her body was actually tattered or frayed, like some sort of fabric. I noticed that her limbs were really long. I noticed she only had a few grass-like hairs on her head. I noticed how awkwardly she walked in stiff, jerky movements. When she finally came into clear view, I understood why my friends looked so terrified. Just a few meters away stood the ugliest, weirdest creature I had ever seen. A sight which would haunt our memories for the rest of our living minutes. She breathed like a tire deflating. Her head was covered by a few patches of grass. Her torso stretched to 7 feet high, and her arms were like long, lanky pieces of wood. Her skin resembled the flaked fiber of wooden trunks. She had only one eye, on the left, which was a pure silver color. It had no iris, but I could tell it was looking straight at us. For a few seconds, none of us moved. Her eyeball rolled from me to Alice, then to Brad, then to Adam, then to the rest of us. From the corner of my eye, I saw Adam step forward and place his eye at the lens of the camera, crouching slightly to get a good shot of it.
Adam, no!
I tried to warn him, but it was too late. Adam pressed the trigger. The light flared from his camera and right into the thing's beady little eyeball. The creature flinched in shock, letting out the most haunting and blood-curdling scream. Her scream echoed in our ears, ringing like a million sirens. She crouched down on all fours and in the blink of an eye charged straight at us. Alice screamed as she sprinted in the opposite direction. Without thinking, we ran after her. We were running the wrong way, I knew, but it was too late. We had to escape from that thing. Adrenaline shot through my body as I felt my heart pound loudly in my ears. We ran blindly along that path of fog, which became thicker and thicker as we ran.
I think we lost her!
Brad screamed, his voice hoarse. We slowed our pace, but remained on high alert. The fog was thicker now, like a solid cloud. All the members in our party were close by. but they looked like faded shadows, like thin fragments.
What the hell was that?
Adam yelled, gasping for breath.
Why don't you ask the guy who got us into this?
I could feel Brad's gaze on me.
Did you even know that creature lives up here?
How would I?
So you didn't know anything about this? I knew it. I just knew it. You just got us here for that stupid money, didn't you?
Brad yelled, his voice echoing through the forest. As he ranted, my mind could only think that, God forbid, he might attract that creature again.
Brad, just shut up. She might hear us.
I'm not shutting up until you admit that I'm right.
I didn't know we'd get a visit from Mrs. Horrifying Plant Lady, all right? The articles said nothing about any of that.
Why the hell would anyone rely on some stupid random article at the back of a paper no one reads? Is that the sort of thing you use to make important life decisions?
That's enough, Brad. Stay quiet or she'll come back.
Adam cut in, coming to my defense.
We should probably go to the other side of this place. That's the way down.
I could tell he was speaking to me.
All right, is everyone here?
I asked. Everyone answered like a disjointed roll call, but I could feel someone's absence.
Wait, where's Alice?
Everyone gazed at each other, scanning to find the brunette in the mist.
She was right here in front of me.
Adam said, unable to disguise the panic in his voice. Everyone was growing frantic with fear. Our breathing was getting faster, irregular, and we shuffled nervously on the dry, sandy path as we continued searching for our friend.
The trees.
Adam finally said.
Maybe she went into the forest.
His voice was trying to reassure himself as much as comfort others.
Yeah, maybe she did.
My throat was like sandpaper.
But what about that monster?
Someone yelled.
She must be quite far behind us by now. We ran for quite a long time,
I said, and stepped forward, ignoring any further protest. Everyone headed to the dense canopy of trees. I felt my shoe dig into the surprisingly wet mud. My feet sank in, and I had to struggle to take one step at a time. No one complained. They all just wanted to find Alice and get out of this weird place. Just a few steps in, someone nearly lost their mind.
Guys, it feels like the mud's sucking me in.
Adam said in a voice of alarm.
It's just mud, Adam. Grow up.
Brad scolded. But I, too, could feel something going on in the mud. I did feel suction, a pull from below.
I feel it,
someone said.
I feel it too!
Another admitted.
Well, I don't.
Brad rolled his eyes.
Grow up, all of you. We need to...
His sentence was interrupted. Without any warning, Brad went down. He didn't lose his balance and stumble. He didn't trip over anything. To all our horror, we watched as Brad was sucked into the muddy, wet ground like it was a giant vacuum cleaner. It happened so fast it was over almost before I could process what I was seeing. And the last thing we saw of him was his hand, with his Rolex watch reaching out of the mud, desperately trying to claw his way to the surface. Adam lunged to his rescue. But within a second, he fell in too, and was quickly submerged in the muck. I heard someone scream, then everyone burst into panic. We tried to run, but the mud was growing thicker and heavier, and worst of all, harder. Hard enough to slow us down. In matters of seconds, everyone around me was sucked in, one by one. I watched helplessly as my friends disappeared, and then, suddenly I was alone. For a second, nothing happened. I was left with white, thick, suffocating fog, and with a curtain of dead silence falling all around me. I knew I was about to be the final victim. I knew I was being watched. I knew I was being saved for the last. And I felt it. The iron grip of a giant, ragged hand wrap around my ankle. I was next. The hand pulled me down with unimaginable strength and force. At first, I felt my body move down wet mud, and then I simply felt like I was falling. It was just a couple of seconds until a long, rough, coil-like structure wrapped around me, holding me firmly in place. I coughed as my throat burned from the mud inside. I gasped for breath and opened my eyes. My jaw hung open at what I saw. On top of me was a large dome of soil with roots hanging down, looking thick and healthy. From the dome protruded an endless number of giant roots, each of which held something at its end in tight, round coils. I wanted to scream when I realized what were in the coils. They were bony remains, human remains, and now I was coiled in just like them. Around me, all my friends were also held tightly in their own coils, all screaming in despair. It took me a moment to realize precisely at what they were screaming. Then I saw them. At the tops of the roots were tiny little creatures, miniature versions of the plant lady we saw earlier. Millions of them crouched on all fours, their silver eyes glaring down at us in a combination of surprise, amusement, and awe. They made the same horrible sound their mother did, and began to crawl down the roots, coming straight for us. I heard Alice scream, and realized that she was on the coil right next to me. The grubby little creatures climbed on her body. I saw one of them sink its teeth into her arm. She screamed in pain, and I felt paralyzed with fear. The same happened to everyone. One by one, I saw their blood, I saw their bones, and I heard their cries grow muffled, and then cease entirely as the creatures devoured them alive. When finally the creatures cleared away from the coils, I saw the remains of all my friends. These people, alive just minutes ago, now lay broken and twisted in the grips of the coil-like rag dolls. Their flesh and muscles pulled away from their bones. Those creatures must have enjoyed my expression of pure horror. Then they began to crawl toward me. I was their main course. I could barely whimper as I struggled on the root coils, trying to pry them off me, trying to cut them with my teeth, trying to do anything to break their fierce grip on me. The coils had the sturdiness of hard cement. There was no escape. The creatures climbed onto my body, and still I fought the inevitable, trying everything to push them away. But just as they descended on me, a loud, ragged voice spoke.
Now, children, leave the next one for mommy.
Those words froze every muscle in my body. I saw her appear as her children scurried away. Her tree bark-like mouth parted into a gruesome grin.
You're a good one,
she said as her enormous hand squeezed my leg.
You've got some nice fleshiness and some glory, muscle.
Her hands released me from the coils as she clasped me in her palm.
I'm glad you're here,
she said happily, sitting down cross-legged on the ground like she was getting ready to have a picnic.
I haven't had such a good meal in ages. After all, no one comes up here.
I screamed as loud as I could, but ignoring my cries, she closed her mouth around my head. I shut my eyes, awaiting the end. A moist, warm gush of wind rushed around my head. Her twig-like teeth pierced the flesh of my neck, and I felt a forceful pull on my head. The excruciating pain overwhelmed me. Every second brought new depths of agony and terror. Finally, just when I could take no more, my vision went black. After that, I felt nothing.
Months later, I can remember all of them, down to the slightest idiosyncrasies and quirks. They were my friends, and they're gone now. There's a hole in my life where they were. Sometimes I'll remember something they said or did. It'll hit me like a ton of bricks. They're gone now. They never existed. I'm sorry for being maudlin and bringing everyone down, but I think this is the only way I can really introduce my story and explain why I feel like this. Why I have to type this out. I think that writing this is the only way I can learn to accept that. I'll try to keep these downer tendencies to myself as I'm writing all this down, but I can't make any promises. I know that being the third wheel in a group can be a terrible thing, but I can think of something worse. Being the fifth wheel. If you're the third wheel, that makes your group a semi-functional tricycle. If you're the fifth wheel, you're left as some obscure car from the 50s that no one remembers or cares about. Imagine not being able to follow the in-jokes and shared history of one couple and multiply that by 2. Getting stuck as the fifth wheel is twice as bad. And that was the frame of mind I had as we all piled into Ian's car to go to Gila National Forest for our hike. I know that's a weird opening to give to after my depressing opening. I want you all to have an idea of my mindset. I'm not quite sure I know how to describe all this, but I do know I need to tell someone. I need someone else to know what happened and help me come to terms with it. I think the only way I'll be able to explain this would be to help you see from my perspective as much as possible. So there we were, driving down to Gila for a hike, with me feeling like the fifth wheel wedged between 2 of Ian's friends who I didn't know. 3 of us cramped in the back seat while Ian and his girlfriend were up front. I look back at the unnecessary bit of moping back in August 2016 as one of the few last moments of normalcy I would have in my life. I tried to make the best of the situation. I really did, but Ian was always the more social of us. My mom would tell us that Ian could make anyone his friend, and that once I had a friend, then I kept them. It was one of those parental platitudes that was given to reassure a socially awkward child that there was nothing wrong. Unfortunately, it would take me almost 19 years to learn that it wasn't true. Instead of taking my therapist's diagnosis of social anxiety disorder following a breakdown after an office get-together as a means of seeking treatment, I used it as an excuse to cloister myself off from the rest of the world. I stayed in my apartment when I wasn't working and told myself that I was just doing what was best for me. Of course, Ian decided that wasn't healthy and convinced me to go on a weekend-long hike with him. It wasn't until I showed up at his house at 6 in the morning on Friday, after taking the day off of work, that I saw that he had invited others along. I think he saw it as a means of getting me help, breaking me out of my shell. Unfortunately, though, with Ian's extroverted nature, he didn't realize that I like being in my shell. It's comfortable. A turtle doesn't like being broken out of its shell. After a brief introduction, where I caught no one's name except for those who I already knew, my brother and his girlfriend Jessica, due to the morning grogginess and the rushed introduction, We packed up in the car and left for our hike. It took 3 hours of mostly awkward silence for us to reach our destination. Ian tried to make conversation, but my short responses and the others' sleepiness killed them off fairly quickly. We found the parking lot near the Gila cliff dwellings. As we unpacked our gear, we took a moment to bask in the beautiful sight that sat perched above us. It's hard to believe that someone could carve an entire town out of the face of a cliff. But 700 years ago, people managed to do just that. Given that the parking lot was empty except for us, we would find out why later. And I was in need of some social lubrication. We split a 6-pack of beer and took in the majesty. As we finished our beers, got everything prepared, and used the restrooms, Ian explained what path we would be taking in detail. What we didn't know, and what my brother had failed to tell us, was that the West Fork Trail had been closed all summer due to the flooding. To be honest, the path wasn't that dangerous. They had just opted not to clear it due to the recent flooding, so it was a bit more of a rugged hike. While it wasn't perilous, it did keep us from encountering other hikers, which would cause us a lot of problems when we actually needed help. Ian figured that we could make about 2 or 3 miles per hour, and we'd be able to complete the Gila Loop, which is about 30 miles long, with enough time to get back on Sunday and be ready for our respective jobs on Monday, with no one any the wiser that we had backpacked a close section of the national park. As his explanation was a bit heavy on names and locations, some of which I can't really recall, I'll opt to include a picture rather than spend a page writing out everything. For the sake of simplicity, this is the path we were planning to take. In addition, I'll include a more detailed map of the entire area so you can orient yourself if you want to trace the trail we took. If you plan on following along with the path, as I tell you about the experience, all I can say is good luck. Even as I stare at it now, I feel just as lost now as I was then. I was just going along with the group and trying to keep a positive mind about everything. I wanted to try to do a better job of getting to know Ian and Jessica's friends. I think my circumstances had finally begun to set in, and I'd been living in a quiet apartment in New Mexico for over a year. I had no friends. I would go to work, go home without doing anything else. Sometimes I would spend an entire weekend without saying a single word to anyone or seeing another person. I know that if I didn't change something quick, that solitude would become the norm. That frightened me. Our first day was relatively quiet. We spent a majority of the time taking in the sights, soaking in the sun, and breathing in the fresh air. The hike felt like we were constantly moving upward. As I was unaccustomed to hiking, I frequently fell behind, but never completely lost sight of my brother's friends. While we took a break under the shade of a tree whose bark looked like the dried scales of some long-dead alligator, I tried to make small talk with everyone. I fell into a quick conversation with Ian and Jessica about their work and what they'd been up to lately. When it came time to talk to the other two, I only managed to get the conversation going for a few sentences before it shriveled up and died. I remembered assuring myself that it would be easier when we stopped for the night. We rested for a while before continuing our ascent up the mesa. This is where everyone realized how truly out of my element I was here. The path up the mesa was agonizing for me. It seemed to never stop climbing up, and there was almost no shade to keep the sun from beating down on us. I was sweating buckets, panting, wheezing whenever they stopped to wait for me to catch up. I tried to pretend that I didn't notice their exasperated whispers or side glances, but it was easier said than done. They seemed like the outdoorsy type that had been doing this sort of thing for years. By the time our path started to level out, I was ready to turn around and leave. It wasn't until I reached the top and looked over everything that I realized how foolish of an idea that was. Even if I was able to convince Ian to give me the keys and let me walk back to the car and go home, I had no idea where I was or what trail markers we'd been using. I imagined splitting off from the group and tromping through the poison ivy, bumbling into a rapey gang of banjo-playing hillfolk, or getting lost in the dark and wandering circles until exhaustion and exposure took me. Even if I did manage to hike back to the parking lot, where was I going to go? Would I go back home to an empty apartment, eat a Hot Pocket, feel sorry for myself again. I decided to tough it out and continue hiking. We made camp at a dry section of the Indian Creek. After having hiked a decent amount, Ian was confident that we would make it back by Sunday and that the next 3 days were going to be less intensive. We had some food and stowed the rest in a bear bag, ways away from the camp. We were passing a bottle of whiskey around in front of the campfire we had built when the conversation shifted to the most awkward moments everyone has experienced. Ian retold his story about the first time he met Jessica at the club, where he was too drunk for his own good and ended up puking in her purse. Jessica bristled at the memory and jokingly called Ian an asshole for it. Each person shared their stories about a bumbling first kiss when their braces got hooked together, locking themselves out of their dorm room in their underwear, their cringe-inducing high school edgelord personality, and caring for their drunken boyfriend who puked into their favorite bag. When the bottle came to me, it was my turn to tell a story. I instantly knew what my most embarrassing story was the moment we started the conversation. I didn't tell them about the door, though. Instead, I made up a story, ripping my pants in front of a group of people during a work interview, and I'd probably ripped straight from a 90s sitcom. They laughed with me, and I felt like a piece of shit. They had bothered to reveal their most embarrassing moments and were commiserating in their shared experiences. And here I was, too afraid to tell the truth, to tell them about the door. The conversation continued a bit afterwards as we killed the bottle. When it was dead, we all went to bed, still pretty drunk after dousing the campfire. I woke up in the middle of the night, desperately needing to use the bathroom. I was still a bit fuzzy from the Boyat whiskey. I tromped out into the woods to do my business. It wasn't until I was almost done that Nadia's voice cut through the blackness. She asked me if I had a lighter. Since I hadn't heard her approach, the sound of her voice made me jump. It would have scared the piss out of me if I'd not just gone to the bathroom. I mumbled something about having a lighter back around the camp, and she told me she had dropped hers and asked if I'd help her look for it, but I was too out of it to be any good to anyone, so I told her we'd look for it later. I vaguely remember her mumbling a protest as I stumbled back to my sleeping row. It wasn't until I woke up the next morning that I realized how stupid I had been. Apparently, they had heard yowling in the surrounding woods all last night. They thought the sound could have possibly belonged to the Mexican gray wolf, but no one was sure. Ian knew that they had inhabited the area, but were very uncommon. I paled at the thought of being mauled by a wolf while out peeing in the middle of the woods. I decided next time I would wake up Ian before going out into the woods to answer nature's call. We packed up a while later, after a light breakfast, and continued on our hike. The second day was a little better. The overbearing sun I suffered under previously was hidden behind heavy clouds. We crossed a number of rivers as we followed the 157-729 junction. We went along the Little Bear Canyon as we headed toward TJ Corral, which was towards the end of the hiking loop. As the path hadn't been cleared yet, we frequently had to dodge patches of poison ivy and stinging nettles. I fared much better on this hike, despite nursing a slight hangover. I felt like I was doing a much better job of getting around with my pack of clunky boots my brother had loaned me. We made camp around midday and purified some water from a nearby river, boiling and adding iodine tablets to them. As the last section of our hike didn't really have many opportunities for drinkable water. I think that maybe our encounter last night with the yipping and yowling wolves had added a bit of seriousness to the hike, as there wasn't as much joking around or conversations this night. We talked a little bit, but mainly just had something small to eat while we stared into the campfire. Ian and Jessica were the first to call it a night. I stayed up with the others for a bit, but we were mostly silent. The other two slowly went off a bit later, and I decided to enjoy the warmth a bit longer before getting ready for bed. Just as I'd finished dousing the fire, I remember Gary coming up to me and asking me for the map. He told me he wanted to plan the rest of our trip, and that there was a spring nearby that we should really visit, and it wasn't too far out of the way. I grabbed the map from Ian's pack and gave it to him before turning in. I woke up the next morning to the sound of Ian rustling around his bag. He sounded angrier the longer he searched. He knocked mess kits into each other as he peered deep into the bag for something he was missing. Frustrated that he wasn't finding the item he was looking for, he turned the bag upside down and dumped out everything. He was practically ready to tear out his own hair, and it seemed like he had spent an entire morning looking for that one thing. Wanting to know what was up, I asked him. We started talking. He asked me, "Hey man, have you seen the map anywhere? I can't seem to find it." "Oh, well, where's Gary?" And I gave him the map last night so he could map out a little detour on the trip so he could visit a spring. Why don't you ask him? He probably knows," I answered. And it was then that Ian said something that changed everything. "Gary? Who are you talking about? Do you mean Oliver? Don't tell me you thought his name was..." I explained. "No, I'm talking about Gary, the tall guy, kinda lanky." "You're joking, right?" He looked confused for a few seconds and made a questioning sound like a really old computer trying to process something moments before it catches on fire. The pieces clicked, and Ian shouted, "Who the fuck is Gary?" getting the attention of everyone in the area. He was... Some fucking guy asked you for our map in the middle of the night and you just fucking give it to him? You handed our stuff to some random stranger you met in the woods?" I tried to explain myself and tell him that I knew Gary and that he did too, since I remember hiking with him the day before. But I couldn't find the words to convey that point. It was here that Jessica stepped in and asked what was going on, and he invented vitriol. "How fucking stupid are you, Evan? Some random guy named Gary comes up to you in the middle of the night asking for our shit and you just give it to him. Jesus Christ! We needed that map to get around smoothly since the trails out here have not been cleared." Ian shouted for about 15 minutes while everyone became aware of our situation. Jessica managed to calm him down enough so that we could figure out our next move. Well, we weren't completely screwed, as Ian had memorized a large portion of the trail markers. It was going to be a lot harder to navigate the necessary junctions to bring us back around to our car. We packed all of our stuff, making sure that the guy hadn't taken anything else, and we left. The entire hike, I could feel Ian's eyes drilling into me. The last time I'd seen him this furious was just before we got into a fight with Aaron Fredlinger and beat him to a pulp. He got suspended for a week, and Aaron got a black eye, busted a lip. Never said anything about our mother again. Each time we came across a break in the path, we spent a few minutes while Ian tried to remember where to go. The fact that the trails had been closed and the paths were overgrown only served to make everything more difficult. I think that's how we made a wrong turn and began wandering to the faint trail. I don't actually know if that's where it went wrong since we didn't have the map at the time, but that's my best guess. Further away from home. Safety. Toward midday, tension had reached a critical point. Ian frequently mumbled things that would make a sailor blush, while Jessica tried to hide the fact that she was close to crying. Oliver attempted to lighten the situation by telling everyone that we would just follow the compass and we would get home safe and sound. Oliver's girlfriend didn't say much. She just stared quietly at her feet as she walked. I think she had the right idea since Lucas was constantly misplacing his footing and slipping. He looked like he had downed a fifth of vodka and was trying to walk home on a tightrope while being randomly shocked with a cattle prod. And the realization twisted something deep inside. It made me want to throw up. I stopped walking and began to talk to Lucas. "Hey, what's going on with you, man?" Ian, still pissed off at me, took this opportunity to vent a bit. "Huh? What are you talking about now?" "Lucas is bumbling and twitching all over the place. What's wrong with him?" "Don't be a dick, man. You know he has multiple sclerosis. We told you before the hike started about his condition." As soon as he said it, the events came rushing back to me as clear as day. I recalled Ian pulling me aside and telling me about his friend's diagnosis, and how it was likely going to be his last opportunity to undertake a long hike like this, so we had to help him and move slowly. I remember watching him scramble up the trail and thinking about our own mom and her illness. It brought back bittersweet memories of birthday wishes given to us from hospital beds and hearing her sob quietly to herself in the middle of the night. She thought we were asleep. Guilt flooded over me. I stepped forward to apologize to Lucas when it happened. Lucas growled at me the instant I stepped forward, dropped to a hunched position on his hands and feet, almost like his skin was bristling at possible threat. I could see his broken, decaying teeth as he hissed at all of us before taking off at a hopping stride into the woods. He moved like one of those CGI monstrosities from the last Planet of the Apes. His shaking and unstable balance was replaced with a more natural and animalistic gait as he lopped into the distance and disappeared amongst the trees. The last thing I saw was what I assumed were his clothes, sloughing off his body, revealing that they weren't actually clothes, but gray folds of skin. Oliver was the first to talk. What the fuck? As soon as Oliver said those words, it was like a switch had flipped and set everyone to panic mode. We began to run along the trail as if it would do us any good. The only thought in my head was to put as much distance as possible between me and that thing. I think it took about 15 minutes for us to run out of energy with our heavy packs and the disorienting nature of the woods. As we tried to catch our breaths, I surveyed the area around us, came to a terrible realization. In our panic, we'd run off the path and were now even deeper into the woods. We tried to make sense of what we saw. I just remember Ian mumbling the same phrase over and over. What the hell was that? What the hell was that? What the hell was that? What the hell? The short answer is that it was Lucas. The long answer of it is this. There was no Lucas. Not really. I'm sorry for interrupting the story in the middle like this, but I think now is the best time to try to explain everything. I know how confusing this all seems with Gary and Lucas. The truth is, I did that because I don't think I could have appropriately explained it to you without first having you experience it from my eyes. I don't know what to call those things, but they do something to your mind. They insinuate themselves into your memories. They wrap themselves up in a wall of your recollections that, even though you know something is wrong, you can't quite put your finger on it. Your group of 4 friends could grow to 5 and you wouldn't be any wiser. A part of you will stupidly admonish you for wondering how many there were. And you look at it, and you recognize the face. You remember events. You remember getting drunk at the bar together. You remember them crying on your shoulder after a rough breakup. You remember everything that happened between you, but none of it's true. I don't know how it does it. It crawls into your head somehow. It makes you see things in a way that benefits them. It can mold memories, but it can't mimic human movement. It walks on all 4s, not 2 feet. It growls, it hisses and snarls, doesn't talk. It infiltrates, observes, and waits. It's hunting us, trying to drive us deeper into the woods. It was succeeding. We never reached much of a conclusion about what that thing was, but we did reach a consensus that we had to get out of here as soon as possible. I watched Ian as he looked around the forest and came to the same realization that I did. We were lost. We didn't tell the others. I think they realized that panicking would only get us in more trouble. Instead, he told us to follow him. With the shock of our encounter setting in, we could do nothing but follow his lead and hope it all worked out. As we walked, we could hear the sounds of distant animals yowling, calling out to each other. The terror of our situation deepened as the others whispered that those were the same sounds that we'd heard the first night out in the woods. Whatever this thing was, it was following us and calling out to other things in the area. At the time, I couldn't stop thinking about one of them barreling out of the underbrush and sinking its black and rotting teeth into my neck before the rest of the group could react. I remember brushing the thought off and mentally reassuring myself that there were 6 of us here, and we'd only actually encountered one of those creatures. As the day pressed on, we seemingly wandered south in an attempt to pick up another trail that would lead us back to the parking lot. I couldn't help but shake a nagging feeling in the back of my mind. It felt like I had forgotten some important deadline that I should have never forgotten about. It wasn't until Oliver mentioned his wish of being back in the car that Jessica stopped dead in her tracks. We all turned towards her, but knew what was coming the second she asked. We only took one car down, right? Ian snapped, more fearful than frustrated. Of course we did. Remember how cramped everyone is with the tiny-ass Prius with all of our camping gear smashed into the trunk? What about it? Jessica went white, as if this were the first time that Ian had ever raised his voice to her. She paused for a moment before asking, "How many of us are there right now? And how many does your car sit?" Ian's car sat 4 people comfortably, 5 uncomfortably. There were 6 of us out in the woods at that moment. Everything happened at once. Ian swore. Oliver's girlfriend gave a half shriek, half gasp, while I looked wide-eyed from person to person, trying to figure out which one of us didn't belong here. Sarah was the only one who managed to say something, and it was... She hadn't finished her words before her jaw popped open. I don't think it dropped open like she was astonished at something. It popped open like it was dislocated from her face. The space between her lips was a massive, sinky, pink void of inflamed gums that looked at least a foot wide. She looked at us with dead and dull eyes as she slowly raised a twitching hand up to her jaw and tried to lock it back into a more human-esque appearance. She popped it back into place with a hollow-sounding squelch of meat and bone shifting into place, as if nothing was wrong about what just happened, before she tried to speak again. Me. Ian was the first to react. He stepped towards the failed facsimile of human and swung his walking stick at her face while bellowing, "Get out of here!" She hopped back from the first attack in a sloppy motion and landed on all fours. Her body shuddered as if an electrical jolt had passed through her. As she slowly backed away from all of us, facing Jessica the entire time. She hissed at us one last time before retreating deeper into the woods with a convulsing lope. It took a moment for all of us to regain our composure before we continued walking, while trying to look in every direction at once. I remember Oliver rambling as we walked. He kept asking, although no one was responding to him, "Did you see how it moved? Did you see how it moved? It was twitching like an epileptic." Did you ever see one of those documentaries about mad cow disease? That thing was twitching and moving like one of those infected cows. What the hell was that thing? Was it a person? What kind of person can do that to their body? It tried to talk to us. He rambled for hours before we had to stop. We had to tell him to shut up because we were worried about that thing hearing us, though that wasn't really the case. We made him stop talking because it only served in scaring us. Despite stopping for the night, none of us actually slept. We sat around the campfire and listened to a sound of high-pitched whining and yelping coming from all around us. It seemed like any time I actually got close to falling asleep, the calls would start up again, jolt me awake. We spoke in hushed whispers, tried to figure out what they wanted with us, even though none of us really wanted to answer that question. The hours dragged on almost endlessly before dawn broke, and we continued our hike. We spent Sunday hiking around and trying to find a familiar sight. Without any real sense of where we were, where we were going, our only hope was to stumble across another hiker, or find an area with high enough vantage point that we could survey the entire area. Unfortunately, any elevations we climbed didn't afford a good view of the area, and it was extremely unlikely that we would find another hiker due to the fact that the trails had been closed. Even if we did, what were the chances that we would trust them and could be certain that it wasn't one of those things? Midway through the day, Ian whispered to me, "Count the people wearing backpacks. One of them is with us again." I casually looked over my shoulder and noticed that one of our group was walking without any gear, and they trailed behind us, but were still in our vicinity. They moved slowly, but didn't show any of the jerking movements of the previous two. The thought that it was learning to mimic our movement unsettled me. Without really thinking, I shucked off my backpack and approached the imposter. Before they knew what was happening, I shoved them as hard as I could. The instant my hands pressed into their shirt, it felt like something slick and warm. It felt give way, like the outer layer falling off of a rotten mango. Their shirts slid off their body into my hands, and I quickly realized it was their skin. This thing was actually naked, but gave the appearance of clothes by altering the color of its almost translucent skin. I dropped the skin that had slothed off, and it hit the ground with a wet slap. The creature toppled backwards and began yelping. I can only describe the sound like... Imagine you get out of your bed in the middle of the night to take a piss. As you're feeling your way through the darkness out of the room, you step on your dog's tail. Imagine that surprised yelp of pain and the surprise that comes along with it. Now forget the sound the dog makes, as it's nothing like what one of those things can vocalize. Just focus on that emotion, the sudden surprise and guilt. Here's the worst part. I shouldn't have felt bad. Those things were stalking and tormenting us. They were likely hunting us, and I felt bad for harming it. I shouldn't have felt bad about it, but it wanted me to. So I did. The thing writhed on the ground on its back for a few seconds, making a pitiful noise before it reached back with its arms and pushed itself upright, its hands in the balls of its feet, its joints popping wetly and its muscles and bones adjusting to fit its new position. That crab walked away while shrieking the entire time as Ian pursued it with his walking stick, hoping to catch up with it and cave its head in. It wasn't until the thing disappeared from sight that I realized that the shrieking wasn't just coming from the monster, but from Jessica as well. It was trying to mimic her response. With Ian gone, and Jessica's scream possibly drawing more of those things to us, I decided that I had to do something. I stepped forward and wrapped her in my arms. She was shaking like a leaf in the wind. I stroked her hair and whispered that it was over. She managed to choke out something about its face. All I could make out was that something was terribly wrong with its face. She calmed down as I told her everything was going to be all right. I didn't believe that myself, but it was the only thing I could think of that might bring her comfort. Ian returned, fuming that the monster escaped, and I awkwardly broke off the hug. Ian didn't say anything. He just started walking. And we continued following him, hoping that he would find the way, but knowing that he probably wouldn't. Six hours later, we settled down for the night. It felt like we'd been going in circles all day and made absolutely no progress. And for all we knew, the thing could have been tinkering around with our memories and convincing us that familiar landmarks were now leading us deeper into the woods. I didn't tell the others, but I think I knew what those things wanted with us. They wanted to lead us deeper into the woods. They were trying to force us to exhaustion. And when we were too weak to defend ourselves, they would descend upon us and eat us. Oliver was right about that. If that thing is similar to us in any way, then those twitching spasms were likely some sort of prion disorder that came from eating humans. After eating some jerky, since we decided against having a fire and drawing more of them to us, we reached the conclusion that we would have to sleep in shifts. I volunteered for the first watch because my insight into the monster's behavior had robbed me from my desire to sleep. The others went off without so much as another word. They were exhausted, and it wasn't until an hour into my watch that I realized I was too. Even given the monster's grotesque appearance, everyone needs to sleep. Jessica joined me about 2 hours into my watch. She admitted that she couldn't sleep after our encounter with the creature, and I nodded in agreement. Both of us had seen something terrible that the others hadn't. We talked for a good 30 minutes about what we thought it was, or how everyone was handling it. She was worried about Ian. She confessed that he is acting erratic, and that it was scaring her. I wrapped my arm around her for a moment and told her that we were all scared. She looked me in the eye, told me that she was glad I was there. And I felt something twist deep down inside me that I had buried a long time ago when I first met her. The longer she stayed with me on watch, and the more personal our conversation became. She confessed that she and Ian had been fighting a lot recently, and she was wondering if they were going to work it all out. At the start of their relationship, they were great together, and he made her feel wonderful, but there was something that didn't quite feel right. Like, there was something missing. I listened to her talk about everything that was going on in her life. I knew I had to do something. I knew that if I didn't do it now, I would regret it. I had to tell her about the door. She listened quietly as I told her everything. It was the event that had precipitated my breakdown at work and my social anxiety disorder diagnosis at the therapist's office. Everything started off simply enough one Friday at work. I was in the lunchroom, eating my sandwich and reading a book as per my usual, while my coworkers talked about their plans for the weekend. One of them was having a housewarming party, and they were inviting everyone at work. I figured that the invitation would only extend to the people he was talking to, until he asked me if I'd be able to make it on Saturday. As it was the first time I had been invited to hang out after work, I chose to go. And I spent all of Saturday getting ready, planning what were interesting topics to bring up in case there was a lull in conversation, and the bottle of wine I was planning to give him as a housewarming gift. After psyching myself up, I left to go to the party with the bottle in hand, and my spirits high. I convinced myself that I was going to be the life of the party, and that maybe if I played my cards right, I could finally find a friend at work that would make time fly by instead of dragging on. It wasn't until I reached the house that false bravado began to crumple apart. I stopped in front of the neighbor's house, as everyone else already had a car parked there. It was then that I felt my heart beating, like I just ran a mile. I began heading up the driveway with the wine bottle in my hands, my palms sweaty. It wasn't until I reached the door that I realized that something was terribly wrong. All the excitement that I'd been building up since Friday afternoon was now replaced with something else. Apprehension. All those topics I'd thought up seemed boring, and all the reassurances I'd given myself seemed hollow. I didn't feel prepared for this at all. At this point, a small part of me whispered something that has stuck with me to this very day. It intimated that they never really wanted me to come out. They'd only given that invitation out of courtesy and didn't actually expect me to come out to their house. It said that if I knocked on the door, then I would be making a fool out of myself. It told me that I wasn't even comfortable in my own skin, so how could I even dare to imagine that they would enjoy my company? They wanted to celebrate with their friends. They didn't want to listen to me fumble for something to talk about. All those fears flashed in front of me, taunting me, demanding that I knock on the door and make myself look like an idiot. And that part of me told me that I was better off alone. And I listened. I turned around without even knocking on the door, and I left. No one had come in, and the music was playing loudly, so I doubt they would have heard me anyways. I shouldn't have been there in the first place. Maybe I saw them watching me from the window. Maybe I didn't. Maybe they were laughing at me as I drove away, frustrated and embarrassed. Maybe they went back to their party and joked about this social retard who seemingly freaked out and ran away from their house while I went home and cried in the shower. Maybe. Jessica listened as I told her the story, and she smiled sadly as I started to cry into her shoulder. All those feelings I had experienced outside of my coworker's house came rushing back. All the fear, foolishness, and phonetic failure smashed into me like waves on the shore. She whispered soothing words in my ear, waited for me to collect myself. Once I did, she pulled away and told me that it wasn't my fault. It was there under the moonlight, with her face inches away from mine, that I did the worst thing I've ever done in my life. I kissed her. It was slow, hesitant, romantic. I looked into her eyes and I saw her beautiful face. She pulled me towards her, and she leaned back. Lost in the moment, I held her against me while telling her all the things I should have said when I first met her, and realized that I loved her. I held her like that for a few moments, afraid that if I let her go, I would lose this perfect moment. She was warm. smelled like wildflowers. She smelled like happiness. For the first time, it felt like a lifetime. I felt comfortable and content. I don't know when I drifted off, but I do remember waking up. In the love-drunk excitement of the previous night, I didn't think once about Ian or the consequences of my decision. I only thought about Jessica. I forgot that she was his girlfriend. What I did last night was a beautiful mistake. And I convinced her to cheat on him with me. I needed to tell him before the truth came out. I needed him to understand how I felt. I got up from the ground and stretched. Jessica was gone. I assumed that she had gone back to her sleeping role in the middle of the night. I walked over to Ian, who was just waking up. He read the sleep out of his eyes and asked me if I stayed up all night. The words bled out of me. Once I started, I couldn't stop. I don't know what happened, man. We were just talking one moment, and then the next, I didn't mean for it to happen. You know I love you, man. I wouldn't do anything to hurt you. It just happened. And I know I can't take it back, but Jessica's cry of surprise cut me off before I could go any further. Both me and Ian turned to the sound of her distress, and we knew instantly what had happened. The backpacks with our compass, food, and water had been stolen. It knew. Don't you see it? God damn it. It knew that we could identify it without a backpack, and it couldn't shape its skin to take the appearance of one, so it stole them away from us. Now the next time it wormed its way into our group, we wouldn't be any the wiser. Jessica and I never talked that night. Jessica never left my brother's side that night. They zipped their sleeping bags together. She didn't open up to me about her worries. I never actually kissed her. I poured my heart out to a thing wearing Jessica's skin that was in my arms. I confessed my truest feelings to an ersatz entity masquerading as a person. I felt sick. The others woke up quickly after hearing Jessica screaming. We quickly searched around the area, hoping to find some scrap of food or some indication of where our stuff had been taken to. We found nothing. It was long gone. We had no food, no water, and no hope. We had no way of telling when one of those things was hijacking our heads and pretending to be a part of the group so it could distract us. With our compass gone, we had no means of following a set direction and hoping to pick up a trail. In short, we were screwed, with a capital S. Oliver demanded to know what I was doing last night, and he wanted to know how I could be so careless as to fall asleep when I should have been watching over them and the gear. I lied and told him that someone had come around in the middle of the night and relieved me from my shift. I didn't mention that it was one of those things impersonating Jessica. I couldn't bear to look at either my brother or his girlfriend in the eyes at that point. Oliver started to yell, but stopped when he saw that I was on the verge of tears. I don't know if it was mercy or disgust that caused him to stop. But it doesn't matter either way. We gathered up the only thing that they hadn't taken in the middle of the night, their sleeping bags, and we continued walking. The hike without water or the prospect of food was unbearable. We were already exhausted, and the realization that we were soon going to be starving and dehydrated only served to sap more of our energy. Within a few hours, my mouth felt gummy and dry. When we were still under the canopy of leaves, the temperature was still in the high 80s, low 90s. It didn't take long for dehydration to set in. I kept licking my lips in an attempt to keep them moist, but I could feel them beginning to crack as my saliva began to dry up. As we walked, Oliver picked up his pace and caught up with me. I looked over at him and knew without him saying anything that another one of those things had joined our group. He whispered, "Don't look directly at it. Just keep it in the corner of your eyes. I think that is how it messes with your mind. It would explain why you remember it that one night, but the rest of us can't. You saw him, but the rest of us didn't. Don't get close, just keep it in the corner of your eyes. It's been trailing us for about a half an hour now. I think it just wants to watch us and follow us." I pretended to be cracking my neck and looked at the tag-along in my peripheral vision. The trail behind us about 30 feet. In its resting state, its facial features appeared staticky. I could make out eyes and a nose, but it was constantly shifting and rippling like bubbling plastic. At this point, we were too tired to even bother chasing it off. We just kept walking and hoped that it wouldn't join the group. It seemed content to keep its distance, keep us in a line of sight. It followed us for about 2 miles before it broke off towards the trees with a shambling, awkward gait. We were too tired to even try to set up a shift system. We just huddled together in an attempt to convince ourselves that we were safer when we were closer together. But every time one of us got comfortable enough to drift off, those things would start making noise. The noise started off as high-pitched yips, whose sound seemed to travel for miles. As the night drew on, it grew more aggressive. I remember one time I was drifting off, hearing the grating rasp of my name. The things weren't just following us, they were learning. They were perfecting their mimicry. The thought disturbed me more than the idea of them out there watching us in the darkness. How long would it take for them to become more human than human? What would they do once they were capable of walking amongst people again? I drifted off to sleep, with that thought beating around in my head like a man trapped inside a wall. We got up on Tuesday morning and left without a word. At this point, there was nothing to say. Some of us had been awake all night without food or water. The constant stress has completely worn us down. We continued hiking in the same direction we'd been going, in false hope that we would come across someone. In the end, our hike looked more like a death march. My feet were covered in blisters. They had ruptured and plastered the soles of my feet to my socks. Every step felt like I was tearing open the wounds a bit more. In an attempt to take my mind off the discomfort, I focused on my brother, who was walking in front of me. He wasn't as much walking as limping forward. He'd stopped using his walking stick and was dragging it behind him like a broken limb. I watched as he stepped over a rock, and the walking stick slipped out of his hand. He kept dragging himself forward, as if nothing happened. He didn't even register it falling out of his hands. It was at that point I knew something was wrong. I knew that my brother wasn't my brother anymore. I quietly picked up the stick as I passed it. Amy went to call out to him and ask if he was all right, but I shushed her. I was so sure that one of those things had replaced him and was now leading us deeper into the woods. I realized that I would only have one chance at this. The instant it knew that we knew, it would try to run away. All it would take is one good swing to the back of its head. We'd be able to take out those things. The stick had a bit of weight to it, about 5 or 6 pounds, enough to crack open a skull if it was swung hard enough. I began walking faster, trying to avoid the underbrush that might give away my position. The thing wearing my brother's skin continued limping forward as I drew closer. I waited until I was within swinging distance before raising the stick above my head. My heart was beating in my chest and my hands were so sweaty, they felt like the stick would slide right out of my hands. I kept on moving forward, completely unaware of what I was about to do. I whispered, "I'm sorry," just before I swung the walking stick down with all of my strength. Ian turned to face me as he mumbled groggily, "I'm sorry for what?" My muscles locked and I stopped mid-swing, and the stick stopped just inches away from his face. He blinked in surprise before muttering, "Evan, what's wrong?" His voice sounded distant and empty. He was in between awake and asleep. It was then that I knew the extent of his condition. He was pale and looked like the slightest breeze would blow him over. He wasn't one of those things. He was delirious from dehydration, sleep deprivation, and starvation. The walking stick fell out of my hand and bounced on the ground next to us. I dropped my tongue across my lips and felt like I was licking sandpaper. I whimpered, "Jesus, Ian, I thought you were one of those things. I almost... Oh, God, I'm so sorry." He didn't react to my apology. He just turned around, continued walking in the direction we were going in. Amy just watched everything unfold, numbly, before she started following him. Oliver shook his head sadly, but didn't look any better. His eyes were glazed, his lips were cracked and red from rubbing at them. I watched my brother shambling forward. It reminded me of one of those voodoo movies where someone is put into a trance and forced to walk until they die from exhaustion. His mouth hung open. He moved like he was being dragged along on puppet strings. I picked up the walking stick and began to follow them. I wondered how much longer he had left, and what any of us could do if he just fell over and stopped walking. I wondered how much longer any of us had. I don't know how long we walked. Everything melted together in a muddled malaise at the time. I remember losing my footing, tripping a few times, but I barely felt it. The third time, I didn't even realize I was lying on the ground until Jessica stepped on me as she was passing by. There was no apology. She was too far gone to recognize what she had stepped on. I dragged myself to my feet and felt lightheaded, but continued putting one foot in front of the other. The fifth time I fell, I wondered if it would have been better for me just to lie down and wait to die. An excited yap behind me from one of those things drove me to my feet. It wasn't until we bumped into a sign for Little Bear Canyon that I realized how close we were to salvation. The post for Little Bear Canyon also had a branching sign that pointed in the direction of TJ Corral, which was only a few miles from where we started at the Gila Cliff Dwellings if we walked along Route 15. Ian was heading in the right direction and we were almost home free. In my excitement, I began calling to the others to let them know that the end was near. I looked around and shouted, "Jessica, Ian, Oliver, Heather, Amy, I know where we need to..." And the words died in my lips. I counted the names. I realized it wasn't over yet. And the others kept moving as if they hadn't heard me talking. The imposters shuffled alongside us, and for once, it was easy to identify them. I don't know whether or not they had let down their guard after seeing our conditions, but this one was obvious. She moved slowly, but her movements didn't convey her exhaustion. Everyone else was sweating and looked like the walking dead, but she was fine. I waited for her to get close enough to follow the trail the others were going down before I raised Ian's walking stick and growled, "Turn around right fucking now! I can see you!" She turned around slowly. I felt my heart skip a beat. She looked almost exactly like Jessica, except for a brown tinge to her hair. She could have been her twin. I knew what it was planning before it even opened its mouth and asked, "What are you doing, Evan?" "Don't call me that," I winced. "What are you rambling about? Please move out of the way. We're almost safe from those things." "I know what you are." Heather turned white at the realization. She began speaking quickly. No, I'm not one of those things, Evan. Please, Evan, you have to remember, there were 6 of us. Those things want us to think that there are only 5 so that they can take one of us out without the others caring. Those things don't want us all. They only want the weakest one. Please, let's go before they catch..." "Shut up!" I snapped. I raised my walking stick in my hand and brandished it at her. "Think about it, Evan. Do I move like one of those things? Do I speak like them? That should be enough proof that I'm human." No. Ian's my brother. Jessica's his girlfriend. No, I'm your girlfriend. I sat on your lap on the car ride. Please don't kill me, please. Evan, I love you. Don't you remember? Evan, I love you. I lowered the stick that was in my hand as the memories bombarded me. I had met her one night when my brother forced me to go out to the club with him. Heather had been sitting at the bar all night drinking. It wasn't until she tried to stand up and fell into my arms that we actually talked. I remember lazy Sundays in bed watching cheesy B sci-fi movies. I remember holding her close to me after making love and hearing her whisper sweet nothings in my ear. I remembered our life together. I rasped, "Heather, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't know." She cooed. "Never, it's not your fault. It's not your fault." She went to touch me, and I sprang back like I'd been bitten by a snake. The instant I heard those words, I knocked. The stick caught her unaware by the side of the face. I felt her jaw give way under the sudden force of the attack. She blurted through her broken teeth. The second strike dented her temple as the temporal bone shattered, and she kept trying to talk, but it was too late. Too much damage had been done. The door was shut to me now. I kept swinging the walking stick down on her head until it splintered and snapped. I looked at her twitching body, and I saw my brother watching in horror. Heather. Oh my God. I spoke through gritted teeth and regarded him with red-rimmed eyes. Come on. We have to go. He went to keep talking, but I walked past him. I didn't want to explain it to him. He eventually ran ahead, invigorated with the prospect of finding rescue on the road. I looked behind me one last time. The last thing I saw was one of those things, dragging away Heather's corpse. It looked emaciated and half mad with starvation. At that very moment, I wasn't afraid of the thing. I just felt pity. Whether or not it forced that emotion on me, I'll never know. I turned away and caught up with the others on Route 15. We were on the road for 15 minutes before we managed to flag down a car, and an ambulance was called for us. The doctors said that our exposure to the elements, combined with our starvation and dehydration, triggered our auditory and visual hallucinations. It's a typical response you'd expect to hear from any half-dead rambling about creatures warping their flesh and memories to drive us to the brink of death so that they can prey on us when we're at our weakest. We spent a week there while receiving treatments, recounting our horrific experiences and then subsequent psych evaluations before we were released. Ian and Jessica refused to talk with me about it. I don't really know Oliver or Amy, so that's off the table too. They just want to forget. I can't forget. Here's the thing. I still remember Nadia asking me to help her find her lighter. I recall staying up late and talking with her by the campfire while she smoked like a chimney. I recognized Gary's terrible puns that he'd make about almost everything, and Luca's determination at hiking this trail while slowly succumbing to the effects of his multiple sclerosis. I can recall whispering sweet nothings to Jessica under the glow of the moonlight. I can recall that clear as day, even months later. I know the conversation we had word for word. I can remember that feeling of her skin against mine and the smell of her hair as I pressed myself against it. When I reached that one true moment of connectivity, I remember Heather pleading, begging me not to kill her. Despite writing this all months later, I can see all those things clearly. Sometimes late at night, I can even remember driving up to Gala National Park with Heather sitting on my lap, playfully grinding against me and telling me how fun our hike was going to be. Sometimes I think about that memory more than I should, since I can't talk to my brother or Jessica about this. I have to find some other outlet. I guess I'm writing all this for that one reason. Catharsis. In the end, I keep wondering if what I did was right. Did I make the right choice? I want you to read this and tell me I had no other option. That risk one of them escaping into the city forced my hand. I know that's not the case. I could have walked away or tried to scare her off, but I didn't. What kind of person can look into someone's eyes, remember all the things we did and the life we had, and do what I did? Who can have all those memories and end everything so casually? It doesn't matter if none of it's real, because in that moment, it was to me. Who can look at someone and feel such love for them before you kill them? The answer to that question is simple now that I ask myself. I just don't like the answer.
The early morning sun poked through my window, let me know it was time to get to work. I yawned, stretched, and put on a pair of shorts with a t-shirt. I could hear the cardinals chirping hello to the serene August morning. It was already in the mid-60s, which meant a very warm and humid day would be on its way. The kids would be here soon, and I needed to make sure everything was ready for the weekend. As the sun inched over the horizon and burned away the morning haze, I checked the cabins and found everything in place for the new campers. Food packed the cabinets and freezers in the mess hall, enough for a large contingent of children. This would be the last weekend of summer camp for the year. Once these kids were gone, the Winoka Nature Reserve would be shuttered and forgotten until spring returned to claim the reserve from winter's icy grip. I checked the list Roger had given me at the beginning of the camp season. I went through the list of participants and stopped at the last unchecked date. This weekend, I would help host the boys of St. Michael's Orphanage. Sorry, we don't use the word orphanage anymore. Political correctness sent out a memo calling St. Michael's a foster child care center. It doesn't matter what name they give it. St. Michael's houses all the unwanted children from broken and abandoned families. These kids were the modern-day wretched refuse the Statue of Liberty talks about on its base. If not for the sizable donation from the Joseph Swift Foundation, these kids would never step foot in Camp Winoka. They were truly the lost souls, and if not for a few caring individuals, would have slipped through the cracks of society without concern. For most of the camping season, snot-nosed rich kids ran around Winoka like they were personally responsible for nature itself. They were privileged, spoiled, and couldn't give a rat's ass about communing with nature and its wonders. The upside to those little rich kids was the money their parents shelled out for us to entertain and amuse their rotten brats for a week. Their cash kept Camp Winoka running and afforded the opportunity to bring in less fortunate kids for camp. Although most of these young souls had never been out of the city, they appreciated the commune with forest life. After 30 years as camp caretaker, this was my payment, seeing the wonder in their eyes when presented with the majesty of nature. With everything in order, I jumped on the camp's ATV and drove back to my Airstream trailer nestled off the camp proper. Looking in my bathroom mirror, I was a little unkempt. I swept back my salt and pepper hair, tied a rubber band around my ponytail, brushed out my beard, dabbed on some deodorant, and slipped into a clean yellow polo shirt with the camp crest. It was about 8 a.m., and the camp would come to life with new explorers soon. I fired up the ATV and went to base camp to await the last campers of the season. I had just finished a Red Delicious when I heard the bus rolling down the dirt road. The Winoka Nature Reserve was an isolated slice of forest in the southeast corner of Ohio. It covered over 400 acres of privately protected woods and wildlife. Hiking trails wound through the forest without a telephone pole or a skyscraper littering the landscape. The cabins, mess hall, and even the suspension bridge across Taylor Ravine were all built with solid 19th century ingenuity. A single dirt road was the only way in or out of the reserve. Roger was the first off the bus. As usual, he was filled with energy and covered in summer sweat. Although most counselors were teenagers trying to add a community service star to their college transcript, Roger had fallen in love with Camp Winoka and decided to make it a yearly commitment. He was an able-bodied guy, so I appreciated the help.
Jackson, how's it going, you old mountain man?
Roger thrust out a hand. I shook it. Everything's primed and ready to roll, Roger. While the other counselors tended to the kids, Roger slung an arm around my neck and walked me away from the unloading bus.
Listen, Jackson, there are 22 kids this year, all boys, so we can use cabins A, B, C, and we'll leave cabin D empty. There's a couple rowdy ones, but nothing we can't handle. After all, if we can't handle 24 kids for 3 days, we're in the wrong business.
He laughed and looked at me with a concerned expression.
How's your arthritis?
Good days and bad, Roger, I supplied, but nothing to keep me out of the game.
Good to hear. I'll get with you when the kids are done settling in, and we can go over the schedule. Here's to a great weekend.
He slapped me on the back and returned to the bus. The kids unloaded and settled into their assigned cabins without incident. From the checklist Roger gave me, the kids were 9 to 13 years old, most in the lower part of the age range. Just like every year, we gathered them together in the mess hall for introductions before lunch.
Good afternoon, campers,
Roger cheerfully bellowed. He was met with a semi-enthusiastic hello by the campers.
My name is Roger Lovek, but you can call me Roger. I am the head counselor for your stay at Camp Winnica, and this...
He pointed to the 4 yellow-shirted counselors.
...is Jiry, Glenn, Mitch, and Tom. And this is Mountain Man Jackson.
He pointed to me.
He takes care of the campground all year long and keeps it looking great. If you ever have any problems during your stay, please let myself or one of these men know. We are here to make sure that you have fun and stay safe.
Roger glanced to his clipboard.
With that in mind, we do have a few rules.
The children heaved a collective sigh.
Come on, guys. The rules are here for your protection. The nearest city is 45 minutes away. The nearest hospital is over an hour. Play safe, stay safe, right? Rule number 1. Everyone needs to be in their assigned cabin by 9 o'clock. When you're in the wilderness, the temperature drops about 20 degrees once the sun sets. Unlike the city, there's no streetlights. It gets really dark and very cold quickly. Rule number 2. Every camper will be assigned a buddy. Your buddy is to be with you at all times. Well, unless you're going to the bathroom.
Everybody chuckled at this.
Rule 3. Unless you're being led by a counselor, stick to the blue paths. If you look at your packets, you'll see the paths I'm talking about. Blue paths are safe to walk with your buddy. Red paths are trails approved for walking only when a counselor is with you. The black paths are off limits and are for staff members only. Rule number 4. Trail bikes, paddle boats, and canoes are available on a first-come, first-served basis. The sign-up sheet is located on the bulletin board outside the main cabin. We put up a new sheet after dinner for the next day of unscheduled activity time. And, before you ask, the ATV is for counselor use only. Rule number 5, be respectful of your counselors and fellow campers. We have opened this once-in-a-lifetime chance to enjoy nature. Take advantage of it, not the people around you, and you'll have a great time. What do you say?
The kids offered a civil round of applause. Roger waited for the smattering to die down.
And this year, we are offering a special surprise to the best campers. We will be choosing 6 of the best campers for a Sunday night excursion to the Light of Hope Ruins.
Some kids smiled and nodded.
I can see some of you know the legend. We'll be camping there for the night with an open pit cookout, s'mores, and maybe, just maybe, do a little ghost hunting. How does that sound?
The kids erupted in applause and whistles. I couldn't help but chuckle to myself.
Great! Be on your best behavior, and you can be one of the chosen few. Now, let's all get in line for lunch. We have a lot to see today.
The kids continued to applaud as they lined up for the afternoon meal. I never minded putting meals together when I was in the Army, so it was an easy task. Every day, one of the counselors was assigned to KP with me. Unfortunately, they usually bitched and moaned about it. I never understood that attitude. I mean, get it over with. Don't drag it out by complaining the whole time. Besides, these kids were grateful to have a bologna sandwich, fruit cup, and celery with peanut butter. It was those rich kids that had special menu requests that was the real pain. Needless to say, there are no vegetarians when you're poor. The next couple of days flew by without incident. I'll be honest, I've never seen a group of lightly supervised kids not get into a little mischief when the counselor wasn't around. I guess the Light of Hope camp out was a real draw. For those of you who do not watch those ghost hunting programs, The Light of Hope ruins are one of those places that have spawned many supernatural myths around them. This made life hellish for me. Matter of fact, I spend the majority of my off-season time running off idiots with their ghost-detecting equipment because if anyone gets hurt, the sanctuary would be liable for any injuries sustained. However, it never stopped anyone from spinning a yarn about a campfire or two about the place the media calls Gore Orphanage. Light of Hope was located 3/4 of a mile from the main campground, close to the interstate annex. The 6 winners were easy to choose and were elated when we called their names at the Saturday night assembly. The kids were a bit skittish due to the fact that we had to take one of the black paths through the dense woods, but Roger and I made sure they tucked their pant legs into their socks to prevent ticks and chiggers from getting a free ride to the campsite.
Mr. Jackson, what's that?
Close to the campsite, a kid named Connor Watson pointed into the woods where a clearing appeared. See those old markers? That was a graveyard over 100 years ago, I said.
That's creepy.
The boy had a worried face as I patted his head. Don't worry, Connor. Ghosts don't exist. You're safe. For now. I offered him a wink. We made the site about an hour before sunset and set to the task of putting up the 2 tents. Each tent could fit 8 people comfortably, but were a bit of a pain to set up due to the remnants of brick and stone left from 100 years ago. By the time we had them up, the sun had mostly melted into the horizon. The 6 winners were a bit rowdy and anxious, but we kept them occupied. Roger took half the kids out to forage wood for the campfire, while I took the other half to help prepare dinner. Although Connor was not too happy about deer stew, the others were unaffected. Mark Treasure acted as almost ghoulish in his desire to try it. We set the gallon pot above a healthy fire. Even though every kid was thinking about Gore Orphanage, none of them asked about it. By the time we were ready for s'mores, they were practically chomping at the bit for a ghost story. I served the kids some homemade apple cider I warmed over the fire to keep the cold away while they finished their chocolate graham cracker marshmallow treats. Roger decided he would begin weaving the supernatural tale.
So, has anyone ever heard of Gore Orphanage?
All hands went up.
But does anyone know why it's called Gore Orphanage?
Most of the kids shrugged.
Well, back in the late 1800s, there was an orphanage located on this very spot. You see the bricks and timbers lying around our campsite, right?
They all nodded.
It was once a huge building that housed almost 200 children. It was originally called the Light of Hope Orphanage.
I jumped in. These kids they took in weren't good kids like you. They were mostly runaways and kids that weren't right in the head. And some were downright mean. But they were too young to go to prison, so the authorities put in Light of Hope for rehabilitation. You kids know about what that means. Some nodded, intently listening. That means they hoped the orphanage could help them become good, productive citizens.
But some couldn't be rehabilitated.
Roger sighed.
Some children were dangerous and had to be chained up at bedtime. Some children were locked downstairs in the basement and were only allowed out for an hour a day. The worst of them were isolated in small, lightless parts of the basement and never allowed to play with other children.
The worst of them was a kid by the name of Lowell Frudd, I continued. Think of the meanest kid you know. Now, times that kid by 10. That's how mean he was. Nobody knows what made him so mean or if he was born with the spirit of the devil with him. His first night in Light of Hope, he bit off another kid's ear. They tried chaining him, but he'd pick the locks and hurt other kids. So they put him downstairs where he got free again. This time he hurt a kid so bad that by the time the orderlies got him to the infirmary, the kid was almost dead.
Lowell had broken every finger and toe on the kid, joint by joint,
added Roger.
And then he started on the kid's limbs, snapping his arms and legs one by one.
Roger accentuated this by breaking some dry sticks and tossing them into the campfire. As you can guess, Lowell had become far too dangerous to leave around other kids, I offered. The people in charge decided to lock him away in the basement. They put him in a straitjacket and only let him out for a shower once a month. When they let him to take a shower, they'd also wash down his cell. Let's just say he didn't have the cleanest of bathroom habits.
But how did he eat?
Connor, the youngest of the Winters, asked.
Good question. Once a day, an orderly would bring in a bottle of liquid food, oatmeal or gruel, and force a tube down his throat. They'd empty the bottle straight into his stomach. That method worked until he bit off one of the orderly's fingers. After that, they had to strap him down to feed him.
Come on.
Mark Traeger, the oldest of the Winters, rolled his eyes in disbelief. It's true. A quick, serious look put Mark's doubt in check. They used an old, rusty C-clamp to force his mouth open. Lowell fought them, but only succeeded in breaking off pieces of his teeth. They found records where orderlies refused to feed Lowell because of his creepy, jagged-toothed smile.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that, Jackson.
Roger hid a laugh at my improvisation behind a cough.
Everyone that came in contact with Lowell Frudd was convinced that he had the devil in him. But what could they do? The only way to leave the orphanage was either through an adoption or when they turned 18. People knew no one would adopt Lowell, and it was many years before he was old enough to legally leave. So in that small basement cell he stayed, and years passed.
Roger suddenly stood up.
Sorry, boys. I have to go relieve myself. Jackson, do you mind finishing the story?
I don't know, Roger. Do you think they can handle the rest of the story? To this, the children responded with a chorus of protests. Okay. I'll tell you the rest of the story, as long as you guys promise to clean up afterward and hit the bed. Deal? All agreed, and I passed around the rest of this steaming apple cider, while Roger headed into the woods for privacy. After a few years in the hole, the people who ran the orphanage relaxed and let Lowell out of the straitjacket. They even let him eat real food instead of pouring gruel down his throat. It looked like he might have been turning the corner and was going to make a good citizen after all. However, he had these eyes that looked like they housed the fires of hell. It unnerved everyone who met him. But he was behaving, so he got more and more privileges back, although he was still kept in the basement. Then, on an August night in 1910, a night like this one, it happened. Lowell Frudd picked the locks on his shackles. Any other person held prisoner for years would have made for the doors and escaped, but not Lowell. He went to the storage shed and got several cans of kerosene. Back then, kerosene was used in lamps instead of the light bulbs that we use today. He crept through the night, pouring gallon upon gallon of kerosene all around the building, in the hallways, and any other place he could move without drawing attention to himself. He poured a final trail of kerosene out the main doors and wedged a piece of lumber across the doors, jamming them closed. And then he put a match to the kerosene. The boys gasped. They were hooked. And in that dark night, much like this night, Lowell Frudd laughed as he watched the orderlies and children helplessly pound on the doors and windows as the flames grew taller and hotter. Survivors say he sat down on the front lawn and watched it all burn to the ground, his red eyes glowing, smiling his broken smile.
What a bunch of bull,
offered Mark. You think so? I asked. Here are the facts, young man. On that August night, 172 children and employees died, burned alive. Only 17 children and an orderly survived. By the time fire trucks responded, it was too late. All the firemen could do was watch the Light of Hope orphanage burn to the ground and listen to the dying screams of the trapped orphans. In case you've forgotten, you're sleeping in the ruins of Gore Orphanage. Oh, there's one other fact I should share. The children all held their breath when they asked in unison, "What?" Lowell Fudd's body was never found. The local sheriff's office searched the woods for a week, but they found no survivors, nor did they find Lowell Fudd. The only trace of Lowell was where the survivor said he was sitting on the lawn. A single word was burned into the grass. Home. People say Lowell Fudd roamed the Winoka woods like an animal, wild animal, until his dying day. Some say his spirit still haunts these woods. And on certain nights, like this one, you can hear the wailing of the orphan children, warning the living when Lowell Fudd is lurking about. Wait. Listen. The kids looked at each other as the night sky covered the woods in darkness. Only the occasional crackling of the fire interrupted the silence. Almost on cue, a thin, high-pitched moan filtered through the surrounding trees.
What was that?
Connor sputtered. "I have no idea," I said flatly. "Just stay near the fire." It was then I saw Connor, mouth wide open, pointing toward the woods. One by one, the other kids followed his finger. In the tree line, 2 small red orbs the size of human eyes glowed, and from the thing in the tree line came a single guttural word. The children froze. Their panic drenched the area. The thing advanced again, and they all began shrieking, but huddled close to the fire. Mark even pulled a partially burning stick from the campfire and held it in front of him. It repeated, drawing closer to the campsite. The children were seconds away from blind panic. I exclaimed, "Lowell Fudd, it can't be!" The thing burst from the tree line and into the light of the campfire. The children offered one more unified scream before realization hit them. It was Roger.
Gotcha!
He laughed, walking up to the campfire. He showed them his glasses with the red LED lights and sat down on a log next to the fire. "You kids should know better." I couldn't contain my laughter. "Ghosts don't exist." The kids offered weak protests to the prank, but Roger and I couldn't stop laughing. Once the adrenaline surge died down, the kids complied to our wishes and went to their tents. Roger and I made sure all the boys were secure in their sleeping bags before we returned to the fire.
That worked better than I thought,
said Roger.
I didn't believe you about the moaning thing.
Earlier that week, I had told Roger about how the trucks driving the interstate close to Gore Orphanage caused a sound which, when filtered through the dense forest, sounded like an otherworldly moaning. Many paranormal investigators reported it as evidence of ghosts, but it was quickly debunked as passing big rigs. However, we were going to take advantage of any free story elements we could.
Did everybody have their fill of cider?
Roger looked at the stack of empty cups. No problem there. I stood and stretched. We got a big day tomorrow. Game over.
Is it?
Roger smiled. The kids slept like logs. Roger and I found it difficult to wake them up, in fact. I guess I had put too many sleeping pills in the apple cider. The next morning, the kids made their groggy way back to the main camp and prepared for the return to St. Michael's. I smiled and waved at children whose names I would soon forget. Well, maybe I'd remember one. I'm sure the bus ride back to St. Michael's was uneventful, with the exception of the winners regaining their wits long enough to ask where their fellow orphan was. Roger would handle it with his usual charm, like he had done in the previous years. Probably some excuse like an asthma attack, spider bite from a brown recluse, or some such nonsense. It didn't really matter. There was always a new batch of bright-eyed junior counselors every year. A missing child on the books meant an additional $60,000 went straight into the administrator's pocket. All the angles were covered. Orphans are the lost souls of society and would never be missed. Roger joined me later that day. We strolled into a cabin D, with uncontrollable grins. Connor Watson, eyes a mixture of uncertainty and terror, lay bound and weeping in a corner of the cabin. I told you, Connor, ghosts don't exist. But monsters? Monsters are real. I drew my knife and closed the cabin door.
"12 years ago, I lived in a small town called Fenter. It was a quiet place to grow up, with one school, a doctor's office, a police station, a couple of restaurants, and a host of local shops on the west side. We even had a theater, with films shown a month after the national release date. Over on the east side of town was the residential area, with about 40 houses, the town bar, and the woods that spanned an area of about 20 square miles. Although I'd grown up playing in Fenter Woods, it was still easy to get lost in them. My father used to tell my friends and I to never go past the creek that ran through about a mile in from the road. Still, this gave us plenty of space to play, and we spent many summers building forts and playing hide-and-seek amongst the tall trees. One late summer evening, my friend Jess and I were out near the creek trying to sneak up on the rabbits that inhabited the woods, getting as close as we could before they'd notice and run away. I spent about 10 minutes searching for one, and in my eagerness, I left Jess behind. She'd stopped to examine some oddly shaped rocks, and being impatient, I'd told her to catch up with me when she was finished. I just reached the hill where the creek bent and curved around to travel north for another 3 miles, when I spied a rabbit chewing on some leaves near an oak tree. I held my breath, grabbing my jacket to stop it from flapping in the breeze, and began slowly inching toward it. I was careful to avoid stepping on any twigs. If one snapped underfoot, I'd be busted. With the sun going down, it was likely the last chance I had at the game before I'd have to head home for dinner. The rabbit was blissfully unaware of my presence. Its brown coat was tinged orange by the setting sun, and its ears flopped down like a hunter's hat. The irony didn't escape me as I crept up on it, silent as the leaves floating in the breeze. I smirked. I was just over 3 yards away from it, and it still hadn't noticed me. So far, so good. I slowed my pace even more. I didn't want to make a rookie mistake in my excitement and ruin the opportunity. The rabbit finished its leaf and casually began sniffing the next one before digging in. Less than 7 feet away now, the closest I'd ever gotten. I felt my heart beat in my chest, and for a second, I was scared the rabbit would hear it thudding against my rib cage and dart off. I shook my head and continued up behind it. It was almost within arm's reach. I couldn't believe it. I stretched out my arm, fingers extended. Wait till Jess hears about this, I thought. I'd be the first kid in town to have touched a forest rabbit. My hand was about a foot from brushing its soft pelt. I could see each individual hair on its back, less than a foot away. I'd done it. I'd done it. Suddenly, an ear-splitting scream pierced the air, shattering the silence of the woods and sending the resting birds into a panic, scattering them from the trees. I gasped, and quick as a flash, the rabbit was under the brush and gone forever. I cursed aloud and spat. Damn it! Damn! Damn! Frustration clouding my head. It was a good few seconds before I even stopped to consider where the scream had come from. Then, like a falling tree, it hit me. Jess. I sprinted back up the creek as fast as I could. She'd been about 200 yards back when I'd last seen her, near the old silver birches. It took me about 2 minutes to reach the pile of rocks where we had parted ways. My brow was covered in sweat and my hair was a mess where the wind had whipped through it. But all I could think about was finding Jess. Even though I told myself that the woods were perfectly safe, I cursed myself for having left her alone. I spun around in a circle, scanning for any sign of her, but there was none.
Jess!
I yelled, my voice traveling through the woods and echoing off the trees. It was getting darker, and tall shadows were being cast all around me, like an unearthly net.
Jess, where are you? Call out to me, Jess!
I stood and listened, but there was no reply. I was just about to run further up the creek to where the trail began, thinking that perhaps she had started to make her way back toward home. And then I saw it. It stood on the other side of the creek, about 50 yards away. It was as tall as the lowest branches of the sycamore, which I reckoned to be about 7 feet off the ground. It was covered in black rags, ripped and torn across its thin, wiry body. A hood pulled tightly around its head obscured most of its features. Still, I could make out 2 white, pupilless eyes staring at me from the shadowed recess. I spied the flash of teeth. Long, slender arms with hook-like fingers splaying out from stumped hands, almost dragged against the ground by its sides. I suddenly noticed an overpowering stench and wondered how I'd failed to notice it sooner. I'd smelt it before on the farms when the cattle were harvested in the slaughterhouses. It was the smell of death, thick and despairing. I almost choked, but my mouth wouldn't make a sound. I just kept staring at it, petrified, blood running cold through my veins. Even the birds stopped screeching in protest. Now there was nothing but silence. The creature and I stood on opposite sides of the creek, locked in a gaze that I'm certain I will remember until the day I die. I don't know how long I stood like that. It felt like minutes, but it was probably only a few seconds. Suddenly, it shifted its weight and hunched down. For a moment, I thought it was going to start running at me, and I almost threw up, uncontrollable fear racking my body. Then I realized that it had stooped to collect something from the ground. I cried out silently. It was Jess. Her limp body looked like a doll next to the creature's freakishly proportioned frame. Despite its thin and stick-like body, it easily picked her up with one bony hand, fingers clasped around her waist, teeth bared in a crooked, humorless smile. It opened up part of its shawl and pulled her close against its blackened torso. I caught glimpses of a ribcage and rotten flesh. I reached out my arm as if I could somehow pull her back to me, but in my heart, I knew it was too late. The creature turned and started to stride off, heading deeper into the forest. Even if I had known that area of the woods and had possessed the strength to move my legs, I never could have caught up to it. Before I knew it, the creature had disappeared from sight, as if it had never been there at all. Only the heavy smell of decay was left lingering in the air. The only evidence that I hadn't just imagined the whole thing. I snapped my head around and began to run back towards town. It was a good mile away, and I'd never run that far before. But that day I ran and didn't stop, jumping over fallen logs and ducking branches. I dared not look back. The darkness was nearly total by the time I burst from the undergrowth at the edge of town. I sprinted to the nearby bar and surged through the door, practically collapsing onto the floor. I don't really remember what happened next. From what I was told later on, it took everyone there about 10 minutes to stop me from screaming about the demon I'd seen in the woods and that we had to find Jess. By the time they actually got the story out of me and organized a search party, 2 hours had passed. Jess's dad shook me and shouted at me, asking me over and over what had happened to his baby girl. I could only stare at him, dumbfounded and mute, until my own father dragged him off and told him to get a grip. The sheriff organized the townsfolk into 2 groups and assigned each group a section of the woods to search. I begged my father to stay, but he told me to calm down, that I was in shock and talking nonsense, my mind making up stories to try and make sense of what happened. He sent me home to rest under the watchful eye of my mother as he led one of the groups into the woods. 3 hours passed. I lay in bed, unable to sleep, huddled in my blankets, paranoid of every shadow and creak. I was convinced that it, the nightmare, was going to come back for me, the only witness to its abomination. Then I heard the front door open and the heavy footsteps of men entering the living room downstairs. I listened as they sat down and began to talk.
Damnedest thing I ever seen in my life, Jiry. I don't know what's out there, but it sure riled up the dogs.
I could tell that it was the sheriff speaking. What was it? A bear? Do you think, Sheriff? I didn't know who was speaking, but he sounded young. Maybe one of the farmhands.
Maybe. All I know is that 2 of my best tracker hounds caught a scent and started going mad. They tore off into the woods faster than I've ever seen them run, and they didn't come back. Jesus, now we're down 2 dogs and a little girl.
Then I heard my dad's voice. I eased up a little bit. Knowing he was back in the house made me feel safer. Chris said he found the poor girl's gloves down by the creek, right where my boy said they were playing. The unknown voice, presumably Chris, came again. It's true. They were covered in some kind of slime or something. Don't know what, but it smelled god-awful. One of the boys almost upped his liquor.
Okay, well, at least we know she was there. I'm not hoping for much, but I'll pray. It's one big forest, and the chances of finding her are mighty slim.
The sheriff sighed.
I suppose I'd better go tell the family that they should prepare themselves for the worst. Damn, no man should have to outlive his kid in this brutal uncertainty.
Didn't Travis say he saw something big moving through the forest?
Asked another voice. The sheriff responded.
Yeah, he radioed in. Said he saw some kind of, giant moving in the distance. But he's liquored up, and it's dark as the bottom of a well out there. He was probably just jumping at shadows. No, most likely a bear or a wolf or something jumped her from behind and dragged her off.
My father spoke again now, voice raised so everyone could hear.
Okay, let's all go home. It's been a tough night, and there's not much more we can do in the dark. We'll search again tomorrow. Even if it's only a body we find, that's still better than our poor folks not knowing what happened.
I want everyone to tell their kids not to go in the forest anymore till we know for certain what happened. Understood?" There were murmurs of agreement, followed by solemn goodbyes. The men left, and I heard the front door lock shut behind them. My father moved about the main floor for a few minutes before climbing the stairs and going to bed. Before he turned in, he poked his head into my room to check that I was okay. I pretended to be asleep. I had nothing to say. I didn't even know what to tell myself. But one thing I knew for certain, I hadn't been hallucinating. I'd really seen it. And whatever it was, it had Jess. I waited for half an hour after I heard my dad climb into his bed before I sat up and switched on my bedside light. I crept out of bed and got dressed as quietly as I could before descending the stairs. My father had taught me how to shoot and maintain a gun a few years back. It was important knowledge to have out in the country. Hunting was a tradition amongst the men, and when I was old enough, my father would take me camping in the woods to trap and shoot game like his father before him. I knew the spot in the garage where my dad kept his .44 Magnum and rounds. After searching around for a few minutes, I found the key to the lockbox. I opened it, loaded the pistol, and grabbed a flashlight before leaving the house and locking the door behind me. The chilly nighttime air enveloped me and turned my breath to fog. I looked at the forest, once a place of fun and laughter, now dark and sinister in the moonlight. The twisted branches of its many trees stretching towards the sky like skeletal fingers. I swallowed my fear. That thing had Jess, and I intended to do everything I could to get her back. After all, it was my fault for leaving her alone out there. I ignored the lump in my throat and I walked determinedly down the road toward the woods. "Don't worry, Jess," I thought. "I'm coming." As I entered the woods, I immediately began to second-guess myself. I knew that what I was doing was not a sound decision by any definition, and I knew that my foolhardiness could very well get me killed. The thought of bumping into the creature out there, alone in the dark, was more terrifying than I can even describe. Knowing that Jess was in that exact situation herself drove me on. I trudged the familiar old trail for about 20 minutes until I came to the creek. I had never been there in the dark before. Although everything was where it should be, it looked different. Under cover of night, it was an alien place. The creature's domain. And I was an unwelcome stranger. I had no idea what lay beyond the creek, save for what I'd seen in the immediate area earlier that day. Carefully, I crossed the creek, the water soaking through my boots and dampening my trouser legs. As soon as I stepped over to the other side, I felt like I was lost. How could I get back? Which direction would I go? I ignored the first question. I had bigger things to worry about and decided to head off in the direction I'd last seen the creature going. I started walking, vigilant for any signs of movement or noise. I'd expected there to be animals out this late at night, but it was eerily silent. In my vulnerable state, every crackling footstep sounded to me like an alarm, alerting the creature to my presence. I stopped for a moment and looked around with my flashlight. I felt like the darkness was swallowing me, that the thing must be sitting just outside the borders of my light, laughing at my efforts to find it. I realized that if there was anything out there, the light would only serve to give away my position, effectively negating any kind of advantage I might have. After a pause, I switched off the flashlight and waited for my eyes to adjust. It was difficult at first, but after a few minutes, I could make out enough of the forest to slowly make my way through. About 10 minutes passed before I heard it. A short, sharp yelp to my left, somewhere in the distance. I paused and waited, listening intently for any other noise. A moment later, a snap echoed through the forest, followed by a dull thump. I was not alone anymore. I crouched down and slowly made my way towards the noise. My experience in sneaking up on rabbits proved essential as I crept stealthily through the dark, distributing my weight carefully so as to remain quiet. After a while, I reached a clearing where the trees parted to reveal a grassy patch about half the size of a football field. In the center of the clearing was a rocky depression that sunk down into the earth. I was about to make my way over and investigate when the creature reappeared. It was near the edge of the clearing to the south and was slowly limping its way over to the depression, dragging something behind it. In the darkness, I couldn't make out what it was pulling, but it appeared to be the size of a child, and it had been snapped in the middle. My stomach turned as I watched the creature's conquest flap limply with the bounce of each step it took. Tears stung my eyes. I swallowed hard. Sorrow and fear swirled within me, impossibly entangled. I prayed to God to not let it be Jess, and continued to watch as the thing reached the pit and hurled the object it carried over the rim. It hit the ground with the unmistakable sound of crunching bone. The creature bent down head first as if to crawl down the rocks, and then it stopped. Slowly, it stood back up and sniffed. I instinctively pressed my back to a tree, removing myself from view, and strained to listen. I heard it sniff again softly and walk around in what sounded like a small circle, and then nothing. I waited. For what seemed like eternity, I waited. I was unbearably tense, expecting to see its milky eyes slowly peer round the side of the tree at any second, or to feel a long, hooked finger slide out of the darkness and fall on my shoulder. But nothing happened immediately. Several minutes later, I was still waiting. Gathering my courage, I hesitantly glanced around the trunk, only to see that the clearing was empty. I double, triple, and quadruple checked the area, sweeping my eyes across every inch of the terrain, making deadly sure the creature was gone. Only then did I step back out to the edge of the clearing, keeping low to the ground. Stepping into the center of an open area was out of the question. Suicidal, even. What if it was only hiding near the outskirts of the clearing, or waiting in the rocky fissure at the center? The notion went against every survival instinct I had, and yet I had to know. I had come looking for Jess. If I turned back without checking to see whether it was her, crumpled and broken at the bottom of those rocks, I might never know. The sheriff was right. Not knowing was the worst part. Before I stepped out, I pulled the gun out of my waistband and cocked the hammer back, being careful to mute the click by smothering it between my legs. When it was loaded and ready to fire, I began to slowly inch my way away from the safety of the tree line out into the open. I took a few steps and stopped, waiting to see if anything came crashing towards me. When nothing did, I continued my cautious journey to the depression. When I reached the lip, I aimed the gun ahead of me steeled myself, and slowly looked over. It was about 10 feet to the bottom, and its circumference was a little larger than I had expected. One side of the hole was hollow and extended into the ground as a sort of cave, large enough to drive a car through. At the mouth of the cave was the body, slumped over a jagged rock. I glanced around again to ensure nothing was creeping up on me, and then began to lower myself down. I would just need a quick glance to make sure it wasn't, or God forbid was, Jess. And then I'd leave and run back to Fenter. I'd wake my dad and the others and lead them to the cave. And then we'd kill it. At that moment, it occurred to me that the thing might still be in the cave, watching and waiting. Perhaps it watched me struggle down the rock. But if it was in the cave, I reasoned, there was nothing I could do about it. I must be crazy, I thought to myself. I was so afraid that I couldn't feel anything anymore. I continued my descent and remained on high alert, watching for any sign of the creature. No sooner did I confirm that it was in fact gone, when I promptly slipped and fell off the side of the rock, landing awkwardly and sending pain shooting through my ankle. I nearly cursed aloud, but bit down on my lip and shouted silently in my head. Luckily, a quick self-assessment confirmed that nothing was broken or sprained, just aching. I was able to walk on it without a problem. Thank goodness. The last thing I needed was a broken foot. My thoughts had been so preoccupied with the sudden pain that I had momentarily forgotten where I was. Right next to the cadaver. My leg bumped against it, and I spun around, gun at the ready, almost firing it off into the rocks. I quickly berated myself for my itchy trigger finger and looked down. Relief and repulsion washed over me. I could see clearly that it wasn't Jess. In fact, it wasn't even human. Rather, it was the remains of a large dog. One of the sheriff's hounds that had gone missing earlier. Its back was snapped in two and folded in on itself. Its snout was crumbled back into its face, turning it into a flat, tooth-filled gap. Blood, fur, bone, and brain were splattered over it, and one eye hung loosely from its socket. I felt like it was staring right at me. I looked away and felt bile rising in my throat. The smell of death and decay near the cave was overpowering. I dreaded to think about who or what else might be nestled inside. I was about to begin scrambling back up the edge of the depression when I heard a sob. I spun around and stared into the darkness of the cave. It sounded faint, as if it had come from a long way away, echoing through narrow rock passages until it eventually succeeded in finding its way to the surface. It came again. Having heard it twice, there was no mistaking it. It was the sound of a child crying. The first thoughts rushing through my head were ones of joy. She was alive! It had to be Jess, hidden away deep in the creature's lair. No sooner had the thought crossed my mind when I realized, with a fear unlike any I had ever known, that I would have to go into the cave to get her. I had no choice. I couldn't turn back. Living with the guilt would be far worse than anything that might befall me if I entered the cave. Readying my gun, I pulled out the flashlight and switched it on. The beam stung my eyes for a few seconds as they adjusted to the sudden change in brightness. But I could soon see that the cave went on for a few yards before widening into a large rocky chamber with passages of varying sizes leading further underground. I entered the mouth of the cave and shone the light over the walls and floor. The beam danced over bones scattered across the ground. It looked as if every type of animal in the forest had eventually wound up in the creature's lair, torn apart and stripped of flesh. I covered my mouth and nose with the sleeve of my gun hand and continued to walk. I saw 4 passages. The sobbing appeared to be coming from the one furthest to my left. Thankfully, it was one of the wider passages, and I found I could comfortably walk through it with enough room to stand up straight. I struggled to suppress the impulse to run and hide while I still had a chance to save myself. I realized that if the creature came from the mouth of the cave, then and there I would be trapped. If it was already in the cave, I was walking straight into its spindly, disproportionate arms. I swallowed hard and continued to walk. After a couple of yards, the tunnel turned right sharply and opened up into a small version of the chamber from which I had just come. I had stumbled upon a bizarre museum of personal trinkets. Watches, jewelry, passports, letters, glasses, clothes, books, wallets, countless things with unspoken sentimental value. I picked up one of the passports and opened it. Paul Ashcroft, born 1972, Herronford, Ohio. Another read Richard Blunt, born 1954, Westville, California. I shone the light over the letters, noting that the addresses were from places all over the country. Then it dawned on me. I finally understood. It all made sense. The reason I had never seen this thing in the woods before was because it had only recently arrived. It must have traveled from place to place, from forest to national park to desert to mountain, picking people off, taking their effects, before it moved on to the next town. It was like a sick scavenger hunt, the way it killed people and kept their belongings as souvenirs. Another sob brought me back to reality, and I dropped the passport to the ground. I hurriedly moved to the back of the chamber and found another short passage. This opened into a medium-sized cavern, inside of which I saw Jess, sitting on the floor crying. She looked up and shielded her eyes when my light shone over her. Please, let me... She sobbed, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. I stood a moment dumbfounded as I realized that I had been so focused on finding Jess that I hadn't planned an escape. I didn't know quite what to do. Thinking quickly, I decided I had better let her know it was me before deciding on anything. I shone the light upwards, illuminating my face as I moved toward her. Jess stopped sobbing and stared. "Jess!" I whispered and knelt beside her. "I've come to rescue you, but we don't have much time. We need to go now before that thing comes back." She remained motionless for a moment, and then threw her arms around me, her body shaking. "I thought I was going to die down here. I thought it was going to eat me like it did the rest. I don't. It's..." She trailed off, unable to get her words out through the tears. I squeezed her back for a moment and then went to lift her. The sudden sound of metal clanging against rock reverberated through the cave. I shone the light down and my heart sank. She was chained to a heavy metal ring pin that had been nailed deep into the rocks beside her. "I couldn't escape," she sniffed. "I tried to pull it out, but it's no use." I stood for a second, dejected. "I could go and get help. Come back." "No!" she squeaked. "Please don't leave me here." Panic spread across her face, and in that moment I knew all I could do was promise not to leave. I thought for a few moments and then, realizing my only option, took her chin and looked her in the eye. "Jess, I have a gun. I'm going to have to shoot the chain to set you free. It's going to be very loud, and the noise will probably attract the thing here." She said nothing, but looked at me, waiting for me to continue. "As soon as it's broken," I went on, "we're going to have to run for the cave entrance and back through the woods." She looked thoughtful for a moment and then took my chin and nodded, and then she kissed me. I blushed. Here we were, sitting below ground in a monster's cave, and I was blushing. I almost laughed and smiled back at her. I took a moment to regain my composure and then aimed my gun at the chain. "Cover your ears, okay? I'll do it on 3. 1, 2. A guttural moan sounded from the mouth of the cave and echoed down the passages to where we were. I looked at Jess just in time to see the color drain from her face and felt it drain from my own. It was back! Without thinking, I pulled the trigger. The gun cracked. Its sound deafening in such a small place, and the chain shattered. I grabbed Jess before she could react and pulled her up, sprinting towards the makeshift museum behind us. As we entered the chamber, I dove behind a table full of bric-a-brac and pulled her down with me. No sooner had we landed on the floor than I saw the creature enter the room and scramble over to the passage from which we had come. As soon as it was gone from sight, I pulled Jess back to her feet and pushed her in the direction of the entrance to the cave. She didn't need any convincing. Together we ran as fast as our legs could carry us. As the mouth of the cave came into view, a rage-filled scream rang out behind us as the creature discovered its meal was gone. As Jess and I reached our exit point, I could hear wood splintering and the crash of dozens of tiny objects hitting stones as the beast tore through the museum after us. I grabbed Jess's foot and hoisted her up so that she could grab the lip of the fissure and pull herself into the clearing. I spun around and then saw it exit the passage into the main chamber. Its hood had fallen down to expose its inhuman face. I fired a shot in its direction, and it screeched in agony as the bullet connected with its upper leg, knocking it back for a second. Taking advantage of the spare moment, I spun back around, leapt for the edge, and grabbed hold. Jess seized me by the collar and helped pull me up just as hooked fingers brushed the bottom of my shoe. We started to run across the clearing and realized it was morning. In the east, the sun peeked over the horizon, casting a slight glow over the woods and turning the sky a pinkish red. We ran for miles. For hours. The whole while, I could hear Jess's captor crashing through the trees after us. If my bullet hadn't connected, I doubt we would have stood a chance of outrunning it. But somehow, whether by luck or fate, we survived. We reached the creek 45 minutes later. By the time we saw the edge of the woods, we had run, fueled by adrenaline, for over an hour. When we reached Fenter, I fired the gun into the air and collapsed, shaking violently. Within a couple of minutes, a crowd of alarmed townspeople had surrounded us, some asking what had happened, others grabbing and hugging Jess, and most just staring blankly in confusion at the commotion. When Jess's father arrived, he broke down and cried, holding his daughter to his chest and thanking God and me equally for her safe return. When my father arrived, he took the gun from me, put his hand on my shoulder, and gave me a look. It was a look that said he didn't care what had happened. He was just glad I was home and in one piece. We gave a statement to the sheriff. Afterwards, a group was organized and armed. I was asked to lead my dad, the sheriff, and roughly 20 other men to the cave. I was tired and reluctant to go back, but the light of day made me braver and there, beside my dad, I felt safe. After a couple of hours, we came across the clearing and found the cave system just as Jess and I had described. The museum was empty. We found the shattered chain untouched where we had left it. A brief examination of the other caves revealed skeletons, later identified as other missing persons from the towns that bordered Fenter. Forensics later proved that the victims had been dead for some time. We searched the woods until sunset, but found no sign of the creature or which way it might have gone. That night, as I looked out my window before going to sleep, I saw it again, standing at the edge of the woods. It looked at me through my window for a while. I stared back, just like during our first encounter. Then it turned and walked back into the woods. I never saw the creature again. I figured it moved on to another place, away from Fenter. The townsfolk searched for another week, but no further traces of the creature were found. Official reports say that people had been kidnapped, most of them killed, by a maniac, who then evaded capture and escaped into the wilderness. But off the record, the people of Fenter believed Jess. They believed me. These days, the events are a distant memory. Everyone has moved on. Jess attended an out-of-state college and graduated with honors, and is now an animal rights lawyer. I relocated some 30 miles from Fenter and got into farming. Then I met someone and got married and raised a family. But I'll never forget what happened to Jess and I in Fenter Woods. Whenever I go camping or hiking or set foot on a trail, I'm reminded it's still out there. Who knows? It might just be in your town by now.
Every now and then, I think of that night, back when we were still at school. I was studying sciences and you were doing business studies. We used to joke that when we finished school, I would open my own laboratory and be the mad scientist, and you would be the office manager in the short skirts and glasses. You really rocked your glasses. Sometimes I still think back to when we decided to go camping for 5 days that winter, to prove you could cope on your own without your mother doing your laundry and cooking your food for you during vacation. Proving we were adults and could take care of ourselves. The irony of it isn't lost on me. It's so stark that sometimes I almost want to laugh out loud. We really thought we knew everything. Teenage rebellion, we thought we created it. At 19, I think we thought we created the world, or at least improved upon it. God, it was so cold that winter. I only agreed to go because you wanted to, and I thought you would think less of me if I said no. I didn't want you to think I was afraid or too precious to join you in making your statement. I remember you lived with your mom. God knows where your dad was. You always said you didn't care. But maybe if you'd had a stable home life, you wouldn't have needed to prove yourself, and we wouldn't have needed to go camping. I sure as hell had nothing to prove. I was just a poor little rich kid with no family to prove anything to anymore. I just did what you asked me to because I would have done anything for you. I still would. I remember sitting on my bed after we got off the phone, wondering what the hell I had just agreed to, and knowing that because I had said yes, I couldn't backtrack and say no. You would never have forgiven me. I hated camping. No clean water, having to use the wilderness as a bathroom and hoping that nobody chooses that moment to walk past and see me taking a leak. Not being able to shower. The bugs and spiders that always want to welcome you into their territory. Semi-warm, half-cooked food, because campfires in rainstorms really do only blaze in movies. I went camping as a kid with my dad just the once. Neither of us ever wanted to repeat that vacation. It was a horrible experience. My dad tried so hard to make it fun. We dug a fire pit in the mud and gathered wood and leaves, but they wouldn't burn because they were too wet. We had a couple of rambles through the woods. I guess so we could say we tried, but we got soaked to the skin and covered in mud. It was just miserable, and in the end we spent the remainder of the time in our tent, wrapped in our sleeping bags, reading, drawing and playing word games until we could return home again a few days later, without my mother's knowing smile that said, "I told you so," without her ever uttering a single word. I think maybe I'm a lot like my dad in many ways. He would have done anything for my mother. That's why, when she finally died of the cancer that had been eating her up for 7 painful months, he gave up and died soon after her. He spent his whole life living for her. She could have asked for anything, and he would have done it for her. Childhood sweethearts. I guess that's why I don't believe in giving up on a relationship, however difficult it may be. I always believed we could find a way to make it work. When my mother was finally gone, I guess Dad forgot that he had a kid to carry on for, and he let the misery take him. I was so hurt when he died, so angry that they had both abandoned me. My mother, I could understand, she was sick and couldn't help it. Even the doctors couldn't save her. But my father, he just gave up, like I wasn't important. He laid down one night a month after she died and never got back up. The doctors called it broken heart syndrome, where an emotional trauma causes the victim to suffer a sudden rush of stress hormones paralyzing the heart muscles. He died in his sleep. I was 17 years old. I stayed living in the house I grew up in. It reminded me of them and the memories we had shared. I had nowhere else to go, and they left me the house, which was paid for, and more money than I would have ever been able to spend, so I just stayed there. I spent long hours alone in the family mausoleum talking to my parents, sometimes crying, and other times shouting my pain out to them. You helped me through that time. You made it possible for me to stay strong where others would have probably crumbled. You were there for me, right where I needed you, by my side, so to speak. I really can't thank you enough. Your camping trip idea distracted me from everything I had lost and reminded me I still had you. You were so determined about going camping that I knew I would have to go with you. I loved you then. I would follow you to the ends of the earth over burning hot coals and broken glass to prove my love for you if I had to. Camping, I guess, was a small price. I loved how fiery you used to get when you were upset about something. I know that sounds weird because I didn't want you to be upset about anything. But when you were so damn sexy. So, camping it was. I stood there and looked around my room before pulling my backpack out from under my bed and opening my sock drawer. I pulled out my thickest socks and dropped them into the open bag. I would probably need to wear 2 pairs at a time. It was that cold, and I hated being cold. I found my favorite underwear, and then went about packing my warmest clothing. I also packed a few basic toiletries, remembering that there would only be bottled water and a full wash would only be possible on our return. I made a list of foodstuffs we would need and then headed out to the store. I bought chocolate, powdered milk, coffee, bottled water, candy bars, potato chips, cups of noodles you add hot water to, and cereal bars. We needed convenience food. Feel-good food, my dad always called it. I loaded up my car with a few grocery bags and then headed to the mall. I found the camp gear store and started looking through what they had. I still had the tent from when I went camping as a kid, but I wasn't going to rely on my non-existent survival skills this time. I bought a portable cooking fire so we could still eat hot food even if the heavens opened and rained down on us. Some reliable firelighters, sleeping bags, thermal socks, rain ponchos so we stayed dry if we went exploring. I picked up a couple of sporks so we wouldn't have to carry loads of cutlery, and a lantern, a couple of small flashlights, and some batteries. 5 days would be a long time. It was cold and we were going to be away from all of our creature comforts. I called you and talked about the stuff I'd bought. You told me you were going to pick your favorite red sweater. I loved that sweater. It really hugged your curves. I felt better about the whole idea now that I was more prepared for it. We set a time that I would pick you up the next day and hung up the phone. I didn't sleep well that night. I was excited about the time we would spend together, and I was anxious that we would be spending it camping. I got up feeling less refreshed than I would have liked and drove over to your place. Your mother was out when I got there. You looked more excited than I'd seen you look in a long time. You had sparkle in your eyes and looked cute in your black woolen hat with pom-pom ears. You were every guy's dream girl. You wore your dark hair down and the curls bounced around your shoulders. We packed the car with your backpack and set off on our adventure. We drove for a few hours until we reached the forest and parked a little way inside amongst the trees. I felt uneasy about being too far from our transportation. You laughed and made fun of me, saying I was afraid of the bogeyman. I just unpacked our things and started to put the tent up, letting you have your 5 minutes of fun before you started to help. Eventually the tent was secured, and colder and somewhat wetter than I had hoped for, we unpacked our things and were sitting in the tent. Outside it was getting pretty dark because the trees all around us and overhead blocked out the majority of the daylight. We changed into some dry clothes and had food and settled in for the night. The rain was so heavy outside it found its way through the dense foliage above us and drummed a rhythm into the roof of the tent. You thought it was romantic. I was starting to remember how much I hated camping, but kept it to myself because I didn't want to spoil it for you. We spent the night telling ghost stories, your idea, not mine, until we were too tired to keep our eyes open and eventually fell asleep. I slept fitfully, despite being exhausted from the long drive, and woke up several times in the night. Each time I lay there listening to the rain hammering on the tent, the wind howling like a rabid wolf outside, thinking about how isolated we were out there. The tent offered no protection at all from any danger. You, however, were snug and sleeping like a baby. I reminded myself we had told ghost stories all night and put my anxiety down to that. The next morning you woke me up, excited because the rain had stopped, and started breaking open cereal bars for breakfast. I'd thought about boiling water over the portable cooking fire to make coffee, but you wanted to set out and explore while the rain had let up. You were so excited. You looked outside and saw the opportunity for adventure and fun. I looked outside and saw mud and grey light and felt irritated. I must be crazy to be here, I thought. It's only 5 days, I reminded myself. I must be tired. After this, it would be my turn to decide where we spent our next vacation, and it sure as hell wouldn't be in a tent in a bleak forest in the depths of winter. We finished our breakfast, did our bathroom duties in the great outdoors, and put on our ponchos, so if it started raining, we had some protection from it. We wandered around the forest for most of the morning, seeing the occasional winter hare looking for food. I was surprised. I thought everything would be in hibernation. Even with 2 pairs of socks on and gloves, my extremities were tingling from the cold. I never, ever understood what you got out of traipsing through the gloom of that winter forest. We passed a couple of days like this, and with each passing day I could feel my irritation with you growing. You were bright and chirpy about the scenery and about seeing the occasional bird flying over looking for shelter from the freezing elements. I was less than enamored by the wet and bedraggled-looking trees, naked and pathetic in the miserable light. On the 4th day, things changed. I woke up from yet another lousy sleep, feeling like tomorrow couldn't come fast enough. You were hunkered down, legs crossed, surrounded by cereal bars, candy bars, and potato chips, beaming like a small child at a lucky dip. I sighed inwardly and gave you a somewhat forced smile as I reached for something to eat. It was 11 a.m. I had slept really late. You were babbling about some kind of animal you heard in the night and the candy bar you put out for it, which was gone when you woke up. Great, I thought. Our last night here will end with us getting eaten alive by some wild animal she's been feeding in the dark. We were in the middle of our breakfast when I heard a motor. What the hell? I thought. Why would anyone else be out here freezing their asses off? I felt uneasy, but thankfully our tent was well hidden and we weren't on the forest trail, and our vehicle was parked behind foliage, making it pretty hard to see. I had seen too many horror movies to allow us to camp in plain sight for all the world to see us. You really weren't that bothered by it. Probably some other campers, you squealed enthusiastically, and I had to explain to you why we weren't going to dash off and make friends. No common sense or self-preservation whatsoever, I remember thinking, with a lot more than just a small pinch of annoyance. We spent that day staying close to the tent, listening to vehicles driving back and forth and wondering what was going on, but I wasn't feeling brave enough to find out during daylight. We were miles from everywhere. We had no phone signal out here. I wasn't about to let either of us end up as missing person ads on the sides of a milk carton. Finally, darkness did fall and the bizarre traffic ceased. We heated some water and ate some noodles, and you decided we should spend our last night telling more ghost stories and then planning what we would do when we got back home. I was good with that. I was tired, and going home couldn't come fast enough for me. It was late, and we were talking about the assignments we both had due in a couple of weeks when another vehicle drove through the forest. The forest was quiet during the day, but it was even quieter at night because of the lack of birds calling. I peeked out through the tent and saw the headlights to a huge vehicle heading off into the forest beyond us. You grabbed a flashlight and took my hand, hauling me up, and insisted we head off to find out where it was going. In my head, all I could think was that it was the worst, most foolish idea you had ever had. But I had no choice except to keep up with you because we just went dashing off into the darkness. I almost twisted my ankle running after you and had to grab your arm to get you to stop. I snatched the flashlight from you and snapped at you that we didn't need to announce our presence to whoever was out there because there wasn't a hospital for miles. Whoever it was probably wasn't as friendly as the fairies that you had always joked lived at the bottom of your garden. I was seriously starting to have a problem with you at this point and wanted to snarl at you to stop running off like a little girl, but instead we walked forward in as much silence as we could, shocked, given that there were twigs, dead leaves, and mud everywhere, and tree roots to fall over. We walked a full 3 or 4 minutes, my hand cupped over the beam of the torch, which was pointed at the ground so we could just about see where we were going without alerting the whole forest we were there. We followed the sounds of other people and came to a razor wire fence. I almost walked straight into it. You stopped me. I don't know how you saw it, but I was grateful that you had. We crouched down and I couldn't understand what I was seeing at first. There was a clearing that started about 4 feet away from us and stretched for about 20 feet. Then the clearing ended at what looked like a run-down old building, a facility of some sort. What is that doing out here, I wondered. And what's it for? In the middle of the clearing was a bus full of people. The passengers were sat in their seats, staring straight ahead, not moving, like they were statues. I felt properly freaked out by now and just wanted to head back to the tent, zip the door flaps closed and pretend that we weren't there. The bus door suddenly opened, scaring the hell out of me from the sudden noise, and a man climbed down. He walked to the building and opened the door, stepped inside and closed it behind him. The people on the bus hadn't moved an inch. We really shouldn't be here, I thought. Something about this whole picture is very, very wrong. I turned toward you to say that we should head back, as whatever was going on here was none of our business, to find you trying to lift the razor wire and climb through the fence. I couldn't believe it. I wanted to shake you and scream in your face that proving your independence wasn't going to impress anyone if you ended up with a shotgun shell in your head, because the people running this place probably wouldn't take kindly to your intrusion. We had no idea who they were, or what they wanted, or what they were doing, and there was you trying to investigate like Nancy Drew with a death wish. He begged me to let you go to the bus and see what was wrong with those people. They haven't moved or made a sound since they got here, and the door to the bus is open, you argued in whispers. Eventually, just so we could stop making any noise at all, I agreed to let you take a very quick look, and I would keep watch. Though, what I would do if we got caught was anyone's guess. Pee your pants and run like hell, my mind thought traitorously. You crept across the clearing to the steps of the bus. I felt myself being pumped full of adrenaline. Hurry up, my mind snapped. When we get home tomorrow, you can spend the rest of the vacation on your own. I am done with you finding yourself, I silently ranted at you. We are never going camping together again. You were on the bus now, and with the aid of the moonlight I could see you were walking down the aisle like a shadow, the only shadow moving on the whole bus. I felt the bile rising in my throat, and I could feel myself starting to shake. Despite the fact that you had passengers seated either side of you, not a single one of them moved even a fraction of an inch. Yeah, it was dark, but I could see their shadows. They may as well all be dead. That thought sent ice through my veins. Come on, come on, come on, I begged you silently. What's taking you so long? I saw the dark shape of your arm lift and then touch one of the passengers. What are you doing? My mind shrieked at you. The person you touched never so much as wavered, didn't lift their head. Nothing. Oh, God, they are all dead. They must be. I was almost beyond rational thought. Then you vanished from sight, and my heart almost stopped. You stood back up, and a surge of anger, born of fear, spiked through me. I was breathing in the icy air so fast it was making my lungs burn. If anything had have happened, I would have been no use at all. Finally, after what felt like an age, you turned and started walking back toward the front of the bus. Good, I thought. get out of there so we can get out of here. I was almost crying. I was that afraid. How you managed to get yourself onto that bus, I have no idea, but we were in the middle of nowhere and there was a bus full of what looked like corpses outside of God only knew what kind of facility, and it was almost midnight. None of this should be happening. You slowly climbed down the steps of the bus and you were halfway across the clearing when the facility door opened again and the driver came back outside. You fell through the fence just as he got to the front of the bus and climbed back on board. You were trying to breathe as quietly as possible, but I'm sure the whole forest must have been able to hear us. He started the engine up and then drove it around the side of the building. I grabbed your arm and we headed back as quickly and as quietly as we could to the tent. I almost got us lost twice, but you kept us on the right track. I don't know how. My own reasoning was shot and I had trouble recognizing anything. I was so afraid. When we got back to the tent, I looked at you and the look on your face froze my insides. We crouched over the lantern, hiding the low light, because we were fearful of being seen, and in the darkness you told me what you had found. You said the people were alive. There were men and women and 2 children on board, and every single one of them was just staring mutely ahead of them. The passenger you touched never even looked at you, didn't even flinch when you poked them sharply to try and get a reaction from them. Nothing. I really wanted to slap you. I was so frustrated with you. What did you think you were doing, trying to elicit a response? We should have never been there in the first place and had no idea what we were dealing with. And you were trying to make friends with Frankenstein's pets in the dark. You had a strange look on your face, like you wanted to say something, but I was so afraid and angry that I just switched off the lantern and ended the conversation. I wanted daylight to arrive so we could just leave. When morning did finally arrive, I turned to wake you. It was early, 7:30, and light was starting to show its pale face between the trees. You're laying on your side, looking at me with your dark eyes, your face white. I was shocked. You looked sick. I asked you what was wrong, but you didn't reply. You just kept looking at me. Or rather, you were looking straight through me. You had one arm placed on your side with your hand on your pocket. I felt anxiety starting to coil itself around my gut, and I lifted your hand. It looked like there was a tube inside your pocket, and I carefully removed it. My stomach sank to my toes as I realized I was looking at a syringe. What the hell has happened? My shocked mind tried to think. I looked at you and asked you, what was in this? Did you inject yourself? Is this another one of your stupid proving yourself games? What is this? My voice was rising in pitch and I could feel tears welling in my eyes. You couldn't move and you weren't able to talk. Oh my God, you got this from the bus last night, didn't you? I grabbed the bottom of your shirt, yanked it up and looked for needle marks. I couldn't find any, so I lowered the waistband of your jeans and there I found a red scratch against your pale skin. A needle mark. You must have somehow rolled onto the needle in your sleep and injected yourself. I panicked. I didn't know what was in the syringe, in you. All I knew was that we were not supposed to have seen what we saw last night. We were not supposed to have the syringe. You were breathing, and you were alive, but your eyes looked vacant. I packed us up. I needed to think. I bundled you into the car and I drove us out of there. All the way home, I tried to formulate a plan. I couldn't take you to the hospital. There would be too many questions, and facility people may come looking for us. I took you back to my home. I took you down to meet my parents at the family mausoleum. The police would search my house and my car, but nobody would search the mausoleum. I took a long, hard look at myself in the mirror, and tears ran down my face as I silently asked you to forgive me. I then filled a bag full of potatoes and tied rope around it. I looped it round the light fitting on the ceiling of the landing and threw the bag from me. It swung away, and then, on its rebound, it hit me straight in the face. The pain was instant and excruciating. My cheekbone was throbbing as I swung the bag away from me again. It came back, and this time I felt it break my nose. I did it 4 or 5 times, raising my arms at one point to give myself defensive bruising before I stopped. I cut the bag down, put the potatoes away. I went into the kitchen, doused the bag completely in bleach, and then filled it with rocks. I put it into my car and drove to the pond on the way into the town and threw it into the pond and watched it sink. Then I drove to the local police station, covered in my own blood and the filth from the camping trip, and reported you missing. I said that we had been attacked that morning in the early hours before dawn and you had been kidnapped. I had so many injuries that corroborated my story. The police believed me. I guess I was a good actor. They put out an APB and formed search parties to look for you. Searched my home and car as expected. I was taken to the hospital and treated for my injuries. Your mom was informed of what happened. Eventually, in time, the investigation became a cold case. Nobody responded to the posters asking for information on your disappearance. Nobody responded to the missing person ads of you on the side of the milk cartons. Nobody ever saw you again. Your mom turned to alcohol and died a few months later, drank herself to death. I went to her funeral. I figured one of us should, and you weren't able to. I put some flowers on her grave for you. I think you would have liked them. It was a bunch of roses and lilies. The roses for you, and the lilies for her. It's been years since those events. Years and years. It's funny how time passes and some things are ingrained in our memories forever. The clarity doesn't fade and the facts don't change. Things have just become more manageable. You look as beautiful as you always did, and I always dry your hair after I've washed it, into the style that you used to. I still dress you in your red sweater and you still look good in it. You still stare ahead of yourself with a completely vacant look. It's okay if you don't remember me though, because I remember enough about us for the both of us. It's better like this. I don't know what kind of drug those people were trialing in that syringe, but it's really helped our relationship. You allow me to look after you now. You don't have a choice because you can't do anything for yourself, but I make sure to feed you pulped food so you don't choke, and you're clean, and you're well looked after. I've made the basement really comfortable for you, even though you just sit in your chair and never move or speak or do anything. I don't have to listen to you ranting about how you want your independence anymore, or mouthing off at me about how I never support your ideas or understand you. I don't have to listen to the cruel remarks you used to make about how I would never be good enough for you, and how you could do better any time you wanted to. There's none of that now. I can stroke your hair, now flecked with silver, but just as pretty, and hold your hand. I can tell you I love you, because I do. And I know you can hear me even if you can't respond. I can read to you, and we can watch movies together. I always make sure the TV is angled so you can see it.
Even if you do just stare straight through it. It's just you and me now. Forever and always. Just like it's supposed to be.
Chilling tales for